yeah, we're switching mics, or we're putting two on?
Switching
mics.
because they can't hear.
Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, keep going. Should I get up? There we are. Okay.
Okay,
You're taking that one? Okay, there we go. I was just saying, was talking to Bob Lyman last night, and we talk about the bureaucracy, but like the vast majority of the people in the bureaucracy are professional people who are doing what their bosses have asked them to do. So, like, rather than blaming the bureaucrats for what got done, I think we have to do a lot better job of holding their bosses accountable. And I don't know if Paul Heyman's going to be talking about recall tonight or not, but in any event, he's made an absolute believer out of me, and I think out of John Robson, if I'm not mistaken, that like when you look at recall, like hiring somebody and saying if you come into work on Monday, and if as long as you show up for work, we'll give you a credit card and a company vehicle, and your next job review will be 4 years from now. Like, none of us would do that in our personal life, and yet somehow we've come accepted as just business as usual in government. So in any event, let's when we're talking about the bureaucracy, let's keep in mind that the vast majority of them are doing what their bosses had asked them to do. So I mean, we may have to change some of them as well, but we certainly need to change the bosses first. So are we ready there? Is our friend from Australia ready, David? I think there we are. Is Malcolm in, or are we ready to go?
Here Hi there, Danny. Hello, can you Mr. hear me?
Rob. Yes, we can.
Hi there, Danny.
Yes, we can hear. Can you hear me?
Just intermittently at the moment.
Okay, well, they don't have to hear me. We can hear you very well. So as long as we can hear you, so if you're ready, I won't bore you with my stories that my friends here have already heard. I can talk to you about them privately. So if you're ready to go, I think we can hear you. Just do us a mic check so we know we hear you.
I'm ready to go. Is that enough for a mic check?
Yes, that's enough, and we're ready to listen to you. So, welcome to a snowy afternoon in Alberta. We're being plagued by climate change. I think we've had about 3 inches of climate change today. So, anyway, we're looking forward to your comments, and we'll have questions and answer when you're done. Okay?
That's fine. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Danny. Thank you, Danny. And I want to thank, first of all, the organizers and to all participants in the Freedom Conference. It's an honor to be here, and I mean that sincerely, an honor. I'm among honest, I know this because of the topic, I'm among honest, courageous people of integrity. That makes a welcome change from the people I mix with in Parliament. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Canadian climatologist, Professor Tim Ball, as in my opinion, excuse me, the world's most knowledgeable combination of science, climate, weather, environment, policy, politics, history, human behavior. Tim is a real Renaissance man, generous with his time, knowledge, and energy. And he's a man who opened my eyes to the basics, the detailed, the human aspects, and confirmed the utter elegant beauty and wonder and power of nature. And Danny, I want to compliment you for your comments earlier on about the need to hold politicians accountable. That is absolutely crucial. It is the people that give power to governments to govern on behalf of the people, for the people. They get the power to govern from the consent of the governed. That is fundamental. And we need to do a far better job in Western democracies of holding our politicians accountable. It's disgraceful at the moment. Voters have let the countries down. Speaking of being let down, I commented about Tim Ball and how much I appreciate him and what a wonderful man he is. But Canada giving us Tim Ball was the least you could do, because that was to make up for Canada's Maurice Strong, who started, drove, and manipulated the climate alarm criminally and fraudulently. The man was a crook. It's all about money and control to return we the people to being serfs. That was Maurice Strong's aim. I've summarized my work in a letter I wrote to the Prime Minister of our country, and the opposition leader and the Deputy Prime Minister. And I'm very happy, and also to the leader of the Greens, the most dangerous political force in the country. That letter was dated 27th of October, 2021. And I'm happy to make it available to anyone at the conference. It's been made publicly. We haven't pushed it yet, as I'll tell you in a minute. COVID has interrupted our march. We've built a solid foundation, though, for turning the politics on climate change. And I'll discuss that with you in a minute. I'll go back in history a little bit. After 8 years of voluntary work exposing the climate scam and arguing with politicians, academics, bureaucrats, agencies, media, and activists, the very first thing I did in the Senate after being sworn in was to sign a letter to the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industry Research Organizations, our government's, federal government's, science advisors on climate, or pretending to be science advisors on climate. And I demanded a presentation from CSIRO on the science underpinning the climate and energy policies. That was a marked change for me, because instead of debating, as I had previous years, the science and the UN's corruption of science, I reversed the strategy completely to put the onus on those pushing the climate argument to cut human carbon dioxide from the use of hydrocarbon energy. I put the onus on the government. I didn't have to justify my disagreement. I put the onus on the government and the CSIRO. And this is the crucial part. I sought their logical, scientific points. And what I mean by that is the empirical scientific evidence within a logical scientific framework proving cause and effect. That's what decides science. That's what determines science. I had 3 meetings with the CSIRO, each about 2.5, 3 hours long, plus Senate estimates hearings where we get to grill the bureaucrats and the ministers. Now, Tim Ball, what I'm about to say is not bragging. I want to say it for a very important point. Both Tim Ball, who knows a lot about science and politics from around the world, and Mark Morano, likewise, for whom I have enormous respect and affection, said that I am the only politician anywhere in the world to hold a government science agency accountable. That doesn't make me any better than anyone else. What it means is that politicians have failed the people around the world. No other person has relentlessly pursued a government science agency and held them accountable anywhere in the world. And that's how they've got away with this scam. Before talking about what we've done, I want to discuss the hidden costs of this climate scam. In Australia, with just 25 million people, it costs to households at least $13 billion per year, or $1,300 per household additional cost for electricity. So that's not the electrical cost for electricity. That's the additional cost due to this climate scam. And when you think about Australia's median income being $49,000, that leads to a net income of $39,000 a year. $1,300 in additional costs is disgraceful. Secondly, the climate scam accounts for 39% of electricity bills, not the 6.5% government typically quotes. These figures come from government figures. There's a net loss of jobs, with every subsidized solar wind job costing 2.2 jobs in the real economy. The total cost to our economy is a staggering $19 billion a year. What's worse is that farmers' rights to use their property was stolen deceitfully by a so-called conservative government to comply with the UN's Kyoto Protocol. They were not compensated. It was stolen. That's another topic for the future. We're also doing carbon farming. It's a lie. It's carbon dioxide sequestration. And the taxpayers pay, and the food eaters pay, and anyone who travels pays. Anyone who lives in Australia pays eventually. Carbon emissions trading schemes, carbon sequestration, carbon dioxide. Plus the fear and guilt in children. Now, the father of the Senate, despite these costs, the father of the Senate in 2016, Senator Ian MacDonald, said to me, he looked out across me at the Senate chamber and said that he didn't always agree with me, but he gave me credit for being the first and only person to have started the climate science debate in Parliament that the Parliament has never had. So the Parliament has never debated climate science. And based on 8 years as a citizen holding CSIRO accountable using freedom of information requests, plus parliamentary library searches, I knew that the CSIRO had no logical scientific points proving that carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate. Over the course of the next 15 months after September 2016, I asked the CSIRO 3 separate, distinct questions. Very, very simple questions. The first one I started with. I requested the CSIRO to provide the empirical scientific evidence proving that carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate and needs to be cut. The CSIRO refused to say they have ever said that human carbon dioxide is a danger. So we said to them, and by the way, the CSIRO chief executive, Larry Marshall, was present. And so we said to them, well, the politicians are saying that you have said that. And they said, well, you better ask the politicians. So more about that in a minute. When they failed with that question, we got them back again and asked them another question, a simpler question. I requested the CSIRO to present the empirical scientific evidence proving anything unprecedented in climate during the last 10,000 years and attributing it to carbon dioxide from human activity. CSIRO's climate science team admitted that today's temperatures are not unprecedented. Yet here we were, this lie was started based upon unprecedented global warming, catastrophic global warming. They're not unprecedented. We knew that, but the CSIRO confirmed it, their climate science team. So when they failed with that, in Senate estimates, I asked them another question. Could you simply provide the empirical scientific evidence proving that there has been a statistically significant change in climate, in any climate factor, such as temperature, rainfall, drought, storm activity, ocean alkalinity? They failed. And instead, they told me a lie, which we exposed them for misleading Parliament. More on that in the future. In each case, in each of the 3 presentations and Senate estimates hearings, CSIRO presented their choice of scientific evidence with our team cross-examining. They did so in 3 presentations and in a dishonest reply. We responded to all CSIRO presentations with peer-reviewed scientific papers and statements from the authors of the papers that CSIRO cited as evidence. We made a copy of our report, Restoring Scientific Integrity, and I'll discuss that more in the future. I'm happy to make that available to anyone at the conference. I want to acknowledge Peter Bobroff, who has an Order of Australia Medal for services to research. He scoured the internet for 24,000 data sets, and he's another Renaissance man. And his data sets cover climate mostly, but also energy. And they're from around the world, legally obtained, scraped off various scientific and government agencies. So here's what we learned from our presentations with CSIRO. The CSIRO has never stated that carbon dioxide from human activity is dangerous. They admitted that today's temperatures are not unprecedented. They withdrew discredited papers that they had cited as evidence of unprecedented rate of temperature change, and then failed to provide supporting empirical evidence. In fact, in the first presentation, when we asked them to present whatever they wanted, showing it was a danger, they presented, after 50 years of scientific research, they presented 1 paper on temperatures and 1 paper on carbon dioxide. And I'll share those with you in a minute. The CSIRO, and this is fundamental, this is what we're getting at. The CSIRO has never quantified any specific impact of human carbon dioxide from human activity. Never. That is the only foundation for policy. The policies around the world are based on lies and bullshit. The CSIRO relies instead on unvalidated models that give unverified and erroneous projections as evidence. It's not evidence. It's not science. Those models are already erroneous. They relied on discredited and poor quality papers on temperature and carbon dioxide. They admit to not doing due diligence on reports and data from other agencies. They just swallow what they're handed from other agencies who are on the government tit. They revealed little understanding of papers that they cited as evidence. We tore them apart in front of their eyes. They were very embarrassed. They allow politicians and journalists to misrepresent CSIRO science without correction. The media and the other politicians take advantage of that. The CSIRO has misled Parliament. They relied on one paper initially, Marcot's 2013 paper, which Steve McIntyre took a brief 2 weeks to completely dismantle in 2013. Absolute trash. And we showed them that, partly using Steve's work and our own work. Then they came back a few months later and said, we want to present instead, they withdrew Marcot and instead present Le Cavalier, which we showed likewise is completely flawed. 2 out of 2 wrong. They presented Harry's 2001 as their paper on carbon dioxide. Completely wrong. Then they withdrew that and proposed Feldman et al. From 2015. Completely wrong again. They showed no understanding or little understanding of their chosen scientific papers. This is what our climate and energy policies are based on now. The CSIRO resorted to unvalidated models, and they do no due diligence on external agencies. So let's have a look at the conclusions from our investigations with CSIRO. CSIRO's evidence for unprecedented change was easily refuted, and a major breakdown of the peer-reviewed system was revealed in Marcot and Le Cavalier. Secondly, the CSIRO provided no quantified evidence that humans are responsible for any amount of change in any climate factor, nor in any climate variable. None at all. There is no basis for policy. Thirdly, CSIRO would not attribute danger to carbon dioxide from human activity and have not provided evidence to allow any politicians, including ministers, to attribute danger. The CSIRO stated that the determination of danger was a matter for the public or for politicians. The Australian climate policies have never been based on empirical evidence and logical scientific reasoning. Never. After reviewing the peer-reviewed papers that CSIRO cited, it is inconceivable that government policy should be based on the unverified assumption that a peer-reviewed paper is accurate and contains the best available research. I mean, it's laughable. And this is particularly so when key data has been unscientifically fabricated, which we have proof of. Seventh, as Australia's premier government-funded climate science agency, CSIRO's gross deficiencies need to be investigated to establish reasons for CSIRO's deterioration. It once had a fine reputation, no more. The fact that CSIRO abrogated claims of danger to government ministers reveals that it has been afraid to speak out about obviously politically driven deviations from science. Integrity and accountability need to be restored for both research and for presenting scientific conclusions, as well as for scrutinizing political claims and policies supposedly based on science. The CSIRO climate group's pathetic and inadequate, dishonest case does not justify spending tens of billions of dollars, nor does it justify the destruction of trillions of dollars of wealth as a result of climate policies that hurt families, hurt exports, and erode our national security. The onus is now on the federal government and the state government to scrap climate policies unless CSIRO can provide accurate, repeatable, and verifiable empirical scientific evidence within a logical scientific framework that proves carbon dioxide from human activity detrimentally affects climate variability and needs to be cut. Further, the proposed cuts need to be specified in terms of the amount, the impact and effects, together with the costs of making and not making the cuts. This is basic governance. It is basic integrity. Our recommendations: until the government provides scientific proof of scientific quantified effects of human carbon dioxide, all climate policies and related energy policies need to stop immediately. Secondly, Australia needs a royal commission into climate science to restore scientific integrity into all government-funded climate-related science. Thirdly, Australia needs to consider measures to ensure ongoing scientific integrity, including an Office of Scientific Integrity. Such an office would, first of all, ensure scientific accuracy and robustness of all science used as a basis for policy development. Secondly, it would present a more accurate picture of science and guard the people of Australia against political interference in science and against vested interests and global predators misrepresenting science for personal gains. And by global predators, I mean organizations like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. Disgraceful, dishonest, incompetent deceitful organizations. Thirdly, the Office of Science Integrity would establish a mechanism to fact check and review the science being used to establish policy. Now, that can be hijacked by a government body, so we would also make sure that it would manage the mandatory public posting of the science supposedly justifying policy that is claimed to be based on science. This is a policy from America's administration, the Trump administration. I think it was concocted by or proposed by Will Happer, another admirable person for whom I have enormous respect. And it was done so to ensure public scrutiny in the same way that transparency portals have been successful in improving public service accountability for expenditure in some American states. Fourthly, our recommendations: the employment of CSIRO's chief executive, Dr. Larry Marshall, and of a senior director, Dr. Peter Mayfield, needs to be reviewed. Both these executive officers contributed to tarnishing CSIRO's reputation for scientific integrity. Scientific integrity needs to be restored, and given the behavior of Drs. Marshall and Mayfield and their complete failure of oversight, as a minimum, they would seem not capable of restoring scientific integrity. I would support their removal from their offices. Fifth, the parliamentary debate that has never been held needs to start with parties that are advocating climate policies by them presenting to Parliament their empirical evidence in a framework proving causation and justifying their climate policies with specific quantified targets and impacts. We need to put the onus on the activists who are presenting the claim that we need to cut carbon dioxide from human activity. Let me continue just briefly before I start wrapping up. We also asked the chief scientist, the federal government's chief scientist, for a presentation. And he came in the company of the science minister, and we're sitting about a meter apart across the table. And I said to Dr. Finkel, who's been replaced since, but I said to him, okay, away you go. And he talked for 20 minutes. And we interrupted him because he was speaking crap. And we asked him a few fundamental questions. And Dr. Finkel looked at me and said, I'm not a climate scientist, and I don't understand the science. He admitted that after years of running around this country, telling us and the Australian people and industry that we need to cut our carbon dioxide output. He admitted that. I mean, staggering. So we said to him, what we want is a proper presentation from you, at least 4 hours in length, a discussion for 4 hours, cross-examination of the science. That was agreed to. The science minister agreed to that in front of me, right then and there. The date was set. And then a couple of weeks before the due date, we were advised Dr. Finkel wouldn't make it because he was still overseas. Now, presumably he's come back from Australia. Well, we know he has. But they cancelled that and brought the CSIRO on instead for a second presentation. And that's when we started really getting into the CSIRO. Dr. Finkel, the chief scientist for the federal government, the former chief scientist, was asked a question by Senator McDonald in Senate estimates questions. What difference would it make to the world's climate if Australia shut down all human production of carbon dioxide? His answer, it's on the Senate record, virtually nothing. The Bureau of Meteorology, our meteorological service, has unscientifically corrupted the climate records to fabricate global warming. There's global warming, all right, but it's in the computer presentations because they've taken decreased cooling trends and changed them into warming trends. Secondly, they admitted recently under my questioning in Senate estimates hearings that their joint CSIRO Bureau of Meteorology State of the Climate Report contains no empirical scientific evidence proving carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate and needs to be cut. Yet, politicians in this country, media in this country, are pushing this State of the Climate Report every 2 years as evidence that we need to cut carbon dioxide output. The State of the Climate Report, in my opinion, has been written in a way that misleads politicians and journalists. But when they're under pressure, the Bureau of Meteorology's director, the head, admitted that it contains no such evidence. Freedom of information requests that I've done and that I did as a citizen before entering Parliament, and parliamentary library requests since entering the Senate show that no report with empirical scientific evidence proving human carbon dioxide affects climate has ever been presented to any minister or to the Parliament from the Bureau of Meteorology or the CSIRO. Never. Next, the politicians. Politicians admit that they have never. I wrote to some honourable politicians. There are some, not many, but there are some. I wrote to nine of them and asked them for their evidence of human carbon dioxide affecting climate needing to be cut. All 9 wrote back saying they have never received any empirical scientific evidence proving that carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate and needs to be cut. Men of integrity and women of integrity and courage. I also wrote to politicians over many, many years, but most recently last year, politicians who have been implying or proclaiming a climate alarm due to carbon dioxide from human activity. 19 of the mongrels, including the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Opposition Leader, the Greens Leader, prominent alarmists among Cabinet Ministers. Only 4 out of the 19 replied. Not one, 0, with any empirical scientific evidence for their claim. Recently, I changed tactics in Senate estimates, and instead of asking the CSIRO questions, I asked the minister present, and in this case, it was Senator Zed Sejelja. Now, he's a decent sort of a bloke, but he became very, very awkward, looking at the ground and squirming in his chair while failing to answer my simple, basic, fundamental question. These people have no right to govern any country, let alone ours. I've also asked agencies, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've studied every core report, core chapter that claims that warming. There is no evidence. You know that. I've questioned NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, Gavin Schmidt, the director. He admitted things that he wasn't supposed to admit. And once we pointed that out, he stopped communicating with me. I've held universities accountable. I've held academics promoting climate activism and advocacy accountable. Ove Goldberg, David Caroli, Will Steffen, Tim Flannery. I do not call these people scientists. They are not scientists. They don't follow the scientific process. They distort the science. They are academic activists. I've held government agencies, the Department of the Environment, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Agency, and many others accountable for their claims. Not one has been able to provide me with the evidence that we need to cut human production of carbon dioxide. They can't even answer the question when they claim to be pushing clean energy. I say, what do you mean by clean energy? They can't answer that question because carbon dioxide is not dirty. It's fundamental. I've challenged media misrepresentations. I've challenged activists and politicians, challenged chief executives' officers. For example, the ANZ Bank, one of our big 4 banks, the chief executive, Shane Elliott. I asked him for his evidence on which he's based his policies, driving business against the wall. And he said, it's not about the evidence. It's not about the science. It's about the politics now. It's way beyond. I've asked and held accountable vested interests and beneficiaries of climate alarm. I've exposed them. The reality, as you know at this conference, is that there are tens of thousands of scientists who oppose this climate alarm bullshit. The reality is the facts on carbon dioxide show not only that it is not happening, but the claims of it not happening, they cannot happen. Nature alone controls the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the temperature of Earth, it does not depend on the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The costs of policies. Why are you all proposing, this is my question to politicians, why are you all proposing to address a claim problem when you cannot quantify the effect of climate of carbon dioxide from human activity? That is a disgrace. The last 2 sentences of my letter. I await each of you providing me with the logical scientific points quantifying the impact of carbon dioxide from human activity on climate as the basis of your climate and energy policies. That was 8 months ago. I am still waiting. My last sentence. In the absence of you providing such empirical scientific evidence, please cease all climate and energy and related energy policies immediately. These policies are still gutting the country. The core problem is shoddy governance. There's a lack of data underpinning most policies in this country. Their policies contradict the evidence. There's a lack of accountability. Parliaments have failed. And parliaments have failed because the voters don't hold politicians accountable. When Liberal when they're fed up with Liberal, they go to Labor. When they get fed up with Labor, they go to Liberal. We've now started, thanks to COVID, to get a third force into politics, because both the two tired old major parties are controlled by globalist predators. They both push UN policies. That is fact. A lack of parliamentary accountability that bypasses the primary policy question, which should be, should we do anything? If we get an answer to that question, yes, then we ask the second question, what should we do? Then the third question becomes, how should we do it? Considering various alternatives of various costs and benefits considered. Not one of those fundamental steps in governance has been done on climate in this country, and I will bet nowhere else in the world. COVID has been a topic of this conference. COVID has been catastrophic for people, but it's opened people's eyes and revealed the coordinated global response driving this orchestrated scam. COVID exists. It's real. It is a danger to a small population, small part of our population, but it does not warrant. It's nothing more than a seasonal flu. And I've got those figures from the government's chief medical officer. The United Nations World Economic Forum jointly orchestrated aims of unelected socialist global governance are driving COVID mismanagement, because they're aiming to control people and property and all people around the world. It is dishonest, it is corrupt, it is deceitful when people aim to control people with no justification. They do not care about injuries and damage. And it goes beyond climate and climate, COVID, freedoms, restrictions, stealing of freedoms, stealing of basic human rights. Our government is supposed to be looking after farmers. That's what they tell them, one of the coalition partners. Our government is funding to the tune of $64 million the UN's Food Summit, looking at ways of getting rid of beef and lamb from our diet, limiting the consumption of red meat to 1 teaspoon per day, 14 grams. And instead, they're funding to the tune of $64 million, research by the UN onto replacing beef and lamb with insects. Insects. That's what they want to do for our protein. The CSIRO has published a 64-page glossy booklet extolling the virtues of cockroach croissants. I mean, this is absolute rubbish. But we are funding that. They're funding the gender bending, the sexuality distortions, the indoctrinations, family law that's become the slaughterhouse of the nation, destroying families. This has all come from the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. They are arrogant, globalist predators and deluded activists who arrogantly say they can improve the universe. They can arrogantly dictate the future evolution of our planet. They want to tell us how the planet should evolve and arrogantly control people and control nature. They invoke us to break laws of nature and our universe. It is anti-human, it is deceitful, it is dishonest, it is treasonous, it is treacherous. The next steps in our program here are to selectively, we've been interrupted, as I said, for the last 12 months with COVID, but we will be getting onto the climate again and pushing it, informing senior selected journalists, putting political pressure on our parliamentarians. We haven't started doing that yet. We will be educating the public, and because the public is required to put pressure combined with costs that they're suffering to the politicians, because the people are being treated deceitfully and dishonestly. We have 17 scientists from around the world that I've spent 2.5, 3 hours making videos with, very well-known, reputable scientists. You would know every one of the names, and we'll be releasing their work in the future. In conclusion, the United Nations World Economic Forum push on climate is an anti-human scam. It's not about climate, not about the environment, not about science. It contradicts science. It hurts humans. It hurts humanity. It hurts civilization. It reverses human progress. The United Nations and World Economic Forum senior bureaucrats have publicly stated their aim to introduce unelected, socialist, global governance and to control people's livelihoods and lives. Their claims of climate change or alarm are purely political and aim to control people globally, aiming to return we, the people, to being serfs. Putting the onus on the government's science advisors and on Parliament itself and the government itself has revealed that we skeptics, climate skeptics, are on solid ground, strong footing. And we will continue relentlessly until this politically motivated climate scam ends. This fraud, this corruption, this deceit. We have just begun. We will end this scam and we will protect freedom, protect our precious natural environment, restore scientific integrity, protect our economy and restore people's livelihoods, and almost above all else, protect the human spirit, end the unfounded guilt and fear while restoring people's universal connection with nature and restoring people's respect and awe for nature. Science is fundamental for freedom. It is vital for freedom. With the scientific method came objectivity. That meant that instead of relying on the biggest muscles, the biggest bullies, the biggest financial powers, the biggest extremists, we relied instead of coercion on objectivity and truth, on data. That is essential for freedom. This fight about climate is like the fight about COVID. It is not at all about protecting people. It is about restoring freedom so that humans can protect ourselves. I invite you to join with us in putting the onus on those making climate claims to restore integrity and protect our livelihoods, our futures. Thank you very much for the invitation and for listening.
Thank you, Senator. Can you hear that? Did you hear that warm applause? It was very well received. We really appreciate you being here on video as it may be, and we also appreciate you thanking Tim Ball. I think he's one of our colleagues who has probably not got nearly as much credit as he deserves. He was one of the early people into this fight, and for quite some years he was sort of fighting alone. But it's nice to see that we've got a growing army of people on his side. Mark Twain said the surest way to win an argument is to start on the right side of it. And as you know, you and we are on the right side of it along with Tim Ball. And so thank you. Now, we've got we just have a couple of minutes, but do you want to ask a question? Yeah. It's got to be a question, 30 seconds. It's got to be okay. Come on, 30 seconds. We've got one of our 4-minute question guys. We're giving him 30 seconds to ask you a question. 30 seconds and that's it.
Okay, time's on. I'm Malcolm. My name is Mark Kalmanovich. I'm part of the
ask your question.
Salt Bush. Let me finish.
You're going to run out of
You're
time.
using my time. I'm part of the Bitforbes Salt Bush group and also a colleague of Ian Plimer and Tim Ball. I didn't want to ask a question. I wanted to thank you as being the first person that sounds just like me. Thank you.
Well, Norm saved himself by not having a question, so thank you very much. Doug, come on up.
I'll be really quick here. Doug Bebb from Whistler, BC. You made an allusion to a way out of the Liberal Labour merry-go-round in Australia there. I presume you're talking about the United Australia Party. And Clive Palmer seems to be saying the right things on the climate issue and others. How would you assess their electoral chances in your election coming up quickly? And is there any hope from that direction? Thanks.
There is hope, Doug. Thank you for your question. I need to correct you on something. There are 4 or 5, actually 6 or 7 freedom parties now contesting this election. The longest standing of those is our party, the One Nation Party, led by Pauline Hanson. Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. We have 2 senators currently in Parliament. Clive Palmer doesn't have any senators. We will be recommending to voters to vote One Nation One, and then the other freedom parties, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in their order of preferences. The other freedom parties are Informed Medical Options parties, Bobcatters Australia Party, Bob Katter's Australia Party, the Liberty Democrats Party, the United Australia Party, of which Clive Palmer is head, and Craig Kelly, another skeptic, is the political leader of it, and the Australian Citizens Party. These are now the 5 or 6 of us are now forming a very, very strong third force in politics. We're not united as one party, but we are united in recommending to our voters, to people who vote for us, to put the other parties 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 behind us. What we've said very strongly, Doug, is that we need to put the majors last. Put the Greens absolutely last on their preference. We have a preferential system of voting. The Greens last. The Labor Party or the Liberal Party second last. The Liberal Party or Labor Party third last. But number one, we say vote One Nation, then vote the other Freedom Party 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're very, very confident that we will have an increased representation in the Senate, and we'll have an increased representation in the lower house, the House of Representatives. Very confident. But perhaps what I'd like to do is to just honor Tim Ball a little bit more. When I was doing my first speech to the Senate, Danny, I called Tim, just had a small question. And Tim, just off the top of his head, he devoted an hour, 2 hours to me, just having a chat. Wonderful, wonderful man, very friendly. And I want to thank his wife, Martha, who allowed him to have the time with me. But Tim said, just a gem that just popped out of Tim. He said, look, it goes like this. The sun warm, and this is after years of us discussing climate and years of me studying. This is how, back to basics, that man is. The sun sends its energy down to the earth. It goes through the atmosphere without creating much warmth at all. The sun warms the earth's surface, the oceans and the vegetation and the earth itself. The air then cools the surface. The air cools the surface. So how the hell can carbon dioxide be a warming? It can't. The atmosphere is a coolant. That is fundamental. The atmosphere, especially with contact and with conduction and convection, accelerates the removal of air from removal of heat from the earth. Air-cooled motors work because of the same principle. The atmosphere, contrary to that, the atmosphere is described by many alarmists as a blanket. The atmosphere is the bloody opposite of a blanket. It cools people. The second thing is that Tim pointed out that the United Nations says that the effect of carbon dioxide is not so great, but it has a magnifying effect through water vapor. Water vapor is a heat modulator with a net cooling effect around the planet. He pointed out to me the continental effect. The CO2 levels are the same on the coast of Australia, in Sydney, say, and Alice Springs, same latitude. But in the coast, because of the water vapor in the air at the coast, the inland, the low temperatures are higher than inland, and the high temperatures are lower than inland. In Alice Springs, in the center of our country, due to the continental effect, with the same level of carbon dioxide, the morning temperature in the wintertime is far cooler. The hottest temperature in the summertime is far hotter than Sydney. I mean, these are fundamental, basic things that have been glossed over because of the bullshit we've been fed. And Tim Ball, people like Tim Ball, Mark Morano deserve a huge amount of support.
We certainly agree with you on that. Thank you very much. Next question. Go ahead. Donald.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts. My name is Donald Lee. You clearly understand that this is not just mistakes being made in science. This is fraud, and you've used that word. And you're in a position of some political power in Australia. Do you think that you can bring about or cause to happen charges of fraud being brought against some of the key players? The university researchers and university administrators who are receiving government grants to do this research are financially benefiting from this fraud, and they're part of it. So there's fraud and there's financial benefit involved. Do you think that we can start bringing charges of such against people?
Yes, I do. Thank you for your question, Donald. Yes, the answer is definitely yes. We can do that. What we've got to focus on in politics, though, in Parliament, is on prosecuting the political case, because the rest of it becomes distractions from our focus. Our political case, we have to get people in key positions to acknowledge that they are wrong. And we have already got 9 politicians who've admitted that they have never been given the evidence. Well, what the hell are the policies of their own parties and their own government based upon? It's based on rubbish, based on lies, deceit, fraud, and corruption. We have to go after people like, I know he's dead now, Maurice Strong, and paint them as the villains, because they are the villains. They concocted this for an ulterior motive. We have to, and what we've been doing, in my first speech in the Senate, I called for an exit from the United Nations. I called it Oz exit. Brexit was the flavor of the month. I coined Oz exit. Get the hell out of the United Nations. United Nations is a crooked, corrupt, incompetent, dishonest, fraudulent body that is pushing an alternative governance for the whole planet on behalf of global predators. These are the elites of the world. Donald Trump knew about it. I've known about it for about 12 years. I first started researching the climate science, recognized it was wrong. Then I started chasing the perpetrators, the United Nations. Then I started chasing a bit deeper and finding out who was pushing the United Nations. We have sold our country in Australia through the 1975 Lyman Declaration, which both parties signed and then ratified, through the 1992 UN Declaration. The Lima Declaration was the UN Declaration. The 1992 Rio Declaration for 21st Century Global Governance. The 1996 Kyoto Protocol, the UN Kyoto Protocol. The 2015 UN Paris Agreement. I mean, the whole thing is a sham. I could talk for hours on this, but the whole thing is a sham. It is destroying our country. And people in this country, Donald, are waking up, because we have been calling out the UN relentlessly. At first, it was, you're a conspiracy nut. You're a tinfoil hat wearer. Well, all we say to them is, well, thank you very much for confirming that you've got no argument and you've got no data and no logic to beat me. You've called me a name instead. Thank you for confirming that I win. So that's what we're doing here. More and more people are waking up. And now with this COVID scam, we've been prosecuting that case, showing the gross distortions there, and it's used for controlling people. And we're seeing now the World Economic Forum's digital identity transformation being copied and pasted into our legislation. It has been introduced to the Parliament, not formally introduced, but given we've seen the legislation proposed for the digital identity bill. That makes COVID look like child's play. This digital identity bill from the World Economic Forum, copied and pasted, is an absolute disgrace. It will stitch up everything. We have already started calling that out. I'm alone in Australia at the moment, but we are getting the public aware. The public is starting to wake up to this. The digital identity bill. Be very, very wary of it. Various countries are putting it in place in various ways.
Thank you, sir. This may be the last question. We're up against a fairly tight time frame. Foon, you may be the last question. Depends how long it is and how long the answer is.
Yeah, hi. I remember in the early days in the 90s when Tim Ball was first being sued by Dr. Michael Mann, and he appealed to us for funding. This is before crowdfunding, so he had to appeal to known people. So anyway, so he ended up getting a white knight to support his long lawsuit with Michael Mann, and he finally won. Now, I want to know, okay, so I'm really happy that you're one politician, maybe in the world, is standing up to the United Nations climate change panel on climate change. So, in relation to Australia, do you have any sense that the Prime Minister is going to prevail, or is he going to be tossed out because of his treatment of people during the COVID pandemic? And a name comes to mind, Dan Andrews, but maybe I've got the name wrong.
Foon, is it?
Yes.
Yes, Foon,
Yes.
yes.
Thank you for your question. It doesn't matter who is Prime Minister. Dan Andrews, by the way, is the premier of one of our states, Victoria, a real control freak, tyrant. From the so-called Democracy Party, the Labor Party, which used to protect workers. He is destroying his state. But let's get back to the question at hand on the prime ministerial, actually the government elections coming up in 4 weeks. What you'll find is that Scott Morrison, our current prime minister, went to the last election and won that election unexpectedly. He was returned to office based upon his policy that they will not sign 2050 net zero policy from the United Nations. About 12 months ago, he reversed that and he suddenly betrayed his voters. He betrayed the people of Australia. So what we have now is both the Labor Party under Anthony Albanese and the Liberal Party and National Party coalition under Scott Morrison, both proposing the UN's policies of 2050 net zero carbon dioxide. Insanity, dishonesty, deceit, fraud, corruption. That's what we see here. It doesn't matter which one. That's why the third parties, the third force, the freedom parties are coming up. Are making a big rise now. There's a lot of people talking about it. We'll bring accountability back to this country. But it's the same with so many of their policies. The policies between the Liberal Party and Labor Party are almost identical everywhere, on every issue. And they're hurting our country. But we've been getting the message out, and Fern, the encouraging thing is that people are starting to realize that and say, these are treacherous bastards running this country on behalf of the global predators, and they've had enough. Now, I don't suspect that we will have a huge number, but it is quite startling the number of people who say they will never vote Liberal, Labor, or Nationals or Greens ever again. So let's see what happens.
Yes, let's see what happens. Thank you very much, Mr. Robert. You're getting a warm round of applause. We're up against the clock. We have more questions, but we are out of time, and so we'll just thank you very much for taking time to be with us. It's we have some people here at the conference. We'd like to have maybe even have our own country and get out of the United Nations, and we would certainly like to join with some like-minded countries that where their leaders didn't mind calling bullshit. So in any way, thank you very much for taking time to be with us. We'll look forward to when we can be in the same room with you sometime in the future, okay?
I look forward to that too. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the initiative of having the conference. It's all about freedom.
Thank you very much. Take care. Okay, we ran a little bit over there, but we'll we'll take about a 14-minute break. We'll start at 5 after 3. With Bob Lyman's going to be talking about barriers to net zero. But I think there were certainly good questions. I'm sorry to the couple of people who had questions, but you have to stop sometime. So let's take a quick break. I'll just tell you why. Somebody told me earlier you're out of coffee, and I said we're not actually supplying coffee this time. When in 2019, when we were in Red Deer, I didn't read the contract, Pat did, and she said, well, they're charging us for the coffee by the cup. And I said, well, yeah, of course they will. They'll bring out a 100-cup urn, and what's a 100-cup urn worth? $50, maybe $75, who knows? Well, anyway, when the conference was over, I found out what a 100-cup urn was worth. It was $3.50 a cup plus 18% plus 5%. Like the one day the coffee cost more than the food did. So you can be thankful you got food, but we're not buying coffee anymore. So anyway, let's take a break, have a glass of water, and if anybody really needs coffee, I guess there's a McDonald's down the road. But anyway, thank you very much. We got about 13 minutes, and we'll have Robert Lyman.
Okay. So here's your clicker. Forward, backwards. Well, the right goes forward and the left goes backwards. going to put this in here.
Not gonna light up or nothing. So oh yeah, it's got a blue light on there, so it should be charging, right? In this corner here,
I think that means it's connected.
connected to the thing. Yeah. Oh, and you can see it on your screen. Well, they're talking. That's all they're doing.
Okay, folks. Time flies when you're having fun. Listen up, everybody. Hey, David, could you turn my mic on? David, turn on my mic, please. Yeah, I know. There we go. Paul Heyman, the last guy standing down, is buying drinks, and I know how you don't buy drinks. But anyway, listen up, everybody. Listen up, everybody. I was a couple of you guys will be getting tired of grandchildren stories, but nevertheless, that's the only ones I have anymore. Jeannie, hello there. Cam, what's that lady at your table? I forget her name. Tell her she's going to be buying drinks if she doesn't be quiet. Anyway, a week or two ago, our 5-year-old grandson was staying overnight with us, and Pat came home. She had her new briefcase, and he said, "Well, where'd you get that briefcase?" She said, "Well, I'm the new president of the local ladies club." That was fine. That was all. See, I got to make some phone calls. You can go and play with Grandpa for a while. So anyway, I played with him for a while, and she made her phone calls. And the next day, his mom picked him up, and they were driving home, and he said, "How did Grandma get to be a president before Grandpa did?" And I thought, yeah, I'm wondering that too. Like, how's that fair? But in any event, we're staying right on time, or we're just a couple of minutes behind. We've had some amazing presentations. Today we have Bob Lyman, who's we actually first met him at a Friends of Science function. I guess I said we saw you 2 years ago, and you said no, that was 5 years ago. So that's how time flies by. But Bob has been a policy analyst, or worked for the federal government for 37 years. Was a policy analyst, I guess that's what it is. And he's going to talk to us about the barriers to net zero. This is when I guess when when the wishes meet the reality. So in any event, and we're going to have an interesting discussion on this afternoon. So please welcome Bob Lyman, one of my favorite bureaucrats, I must say.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. I really appreciate that kind introduction. I want to thank you and the other organizers of the conference for inviting me, just notwithstanding the fact that I'm a long-time federal public servant. To tell you the truth, I feel a little bit like Paris Hilton's new husband on their wedding night. I know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure that I'm able to make it interesting. But I'll try. As Danny said, I'm going to be talking about the barriers to net zero emissions reduction. That's not speed bumps, it's genuine barriers, technological, economic, materials, and political barriers to them. Everyone seems to have his or her own definition of what net zero means, but I think it means almost completely eliminating the use of hydrocarbons in the Canadian economy and doing so by 2050. I will explain why, in my view, that makes no sense whatsoever, either in global or in national terms. If I tried to list all of the reasons, I would be here for a very long time. So I'm going to focus on the ones that I consider to be most important. Okay, climate campaigners tell us every day that Canada has an essential role to play in international cooperation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, they acknowledge that the problem, if any, is global in nature, and that the response to it has to be based upon international collaboration. But what evidence is there that the countries of the world are genuinely willing to significantly reduce their emissions? How much energy use would they actually have to decline? That graph up there helps to illustrate it, because remember that over the period from 2010 to 2018, the world spent $3.7 trillion promoting the increased use of renewable energy, wind, solar, biomass. And yet, by 2020, those three sources only constituted 5% of the world's primary energy consumption. 95% were other energy sources, and 84% were hydrocarbons. Climate campaigners, tell us that international cooperation will succeed in reducing emissions and even the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This graph shows the effects of past conferences and agreements, and it was one that Mark Morano mentioned. On one axis, you have the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as measured by the Mauna Loa laboratory in Hawaii. And the other axis shows the passage of time starting in 1960 and going to about 2020. It shows that over about 30 years of climate conferences, global greenhouse gas emissions rose by 60%. CO2 concentrations rose from about 350 parts per million to about 415 parts per million. Now, this didn't happen because of a lack of emission reduction targets. Every few years, the politicians and bureaucrats who attended those conferences set ever more demanding targets. However, with the exception of a few countries in Europe, no country ever succeeded in achieving the emission reduction targets that it set for itself. But targets are like promises, and too often promises live on empty, too often lives are given up as a result of those empty promises. The two most important recent international conferences were in 2015 in Paris and 2021 in Glasgow. Since 2015, political leaders and the media and the OECD countries have claimed that the world is committed by treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve certain targets. In fact, the Paris Accord had contained no legally binding emission reduction commitments. It only committed the countries to provide plans every 5 years as to what, if anything, they plan to do to reduce emissions. You didn't read that in the Toronto Star, and if you doubt it, just look it up. The Glasgow conference focused much of its attention on trying to persuade the less developed countries, which today account for about 2/3 of global emissions, to adopt more rigorous and ambitious emission reduction targets. It failed. Why? Well, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change contains what might be considered a get-out-of-jail-free card for the developing countries. Let me read it to you. The extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend upon the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under the convention with respect to financial resources and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. In other words, if the richer countries like Canada don't pay, the poorer countries won't play. At Glasgow, the developing countries presented their bill for the cost of their mitigation and adaptation measures. They want $750 billion a year indefinitely. That's not going to happen. So China, India, and the other major developing countries are essentially free to go on increasing their emissions without serious constraint. And they'll do so. Over the last 2 years alone, China has increased its emissions by 750 million tons. That's more over 2 years than all of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So what does that mean for the future? The United States Energy Information Administration is one of the most respected public organizations that publish projections of global energy supply, demand, and emissions. These graphs illustrate the EIA's projections to 2050. What they indicate is that economic and population growth will lead the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions to grow from about 35 billion tons per year now to about 43 billion tons by 2050. Further, all of that growth will take place in the non-OECD or developing countries. Let's compare that to what the United Nations says must happen if the decarbonization goal is to be met. The world would have to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 and by at least 70% by 2050. Instead, the most authoritative source of future energy supply, demand, and emissions projects that emissions will grow by 23%. The world is not decarbonizing. The transition that people talk about is not happening. Let's turn our attention now to Canada. As I suspect most of you already know, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions amount to about 1.6% of the world's total. According to University of Guelph professor Ross McKittrick, completely stopping of all of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions now and forever leaving them stopped would reduce the global concentration of carbon dioxide by about 3 parts per million 100 years from now. With Asia's growth in emissions over that time frame, the climate effects of Canada completely eliminating all hydrocarbons use would be too small to measure. The results of even the most severe climate policies would be symbolic but futile in terms of actual environmental benefits. It will not be possible forever to hide this from the Canadian public. And as time goes on, it must undermine the support for expensive and intrusive emission reduction measures. Now let's talk about energy transitions and start with the basics. Net zero is confronted with the reality that hydrocarbons are nature's most efficient embodiment of primary energy. The combination of high energy density, abundance, stability, safety, portability, safe storability, and affordability are unmatched by any other source of energy. Those demanding that the world transition away from hydrocarbons cannot ignore those facts. Many in Canada and elsewhere say that new technologies are the way to fast transitions, if, of course, we can get taxpayers and consumers to pay part of the costs. Frankly, that depends on the time frame. Movement of technology from scientific discovery to full market commercialization is sometimes called the innovation pathway, and it contains 6 stages. They go from research to discovery, to testing, to demonstration, to initial market penetration, and finally to full commercialization. None of those stages operates according to predictable schedules. This graph shows the long time scales that have been associated with energy transitions in the past. Major transitions typically have taken 50 to 70 years, not 30 years. Vaclav Smil is a retired professor of geography at the University of Manitoba and the world's foremost expert on energy transitions. He's argued that past transitions have been slow, painstaking, and difficult to predict. One reason is that technologies have a lot of inertia. When an economy invests billions or trillions of dollars in the infrastructure to support a particular energy source, it does not readily dispose of those sources or forego the benefits of the infrastructure that has been built. To quote Professor Smil, the idea that the world can be decarbonized in a few decades is a grand delusion. Climate campaigners and their sympathizers, however, believe that governments can use policy instruments to force the pace of change, especially if one assumes that they'll retain the support of the electorate. Doing so, however, this has never been done outside of the centrally planned economies. And no government has ever attempted to prescribe timelines for the commercialization of new technologies. Governments that attempt to do so will substitute for political judgments for the judgments of the free market. Picking winners has a certain cachet with people in industrial policy circles, but it has a long history of failures. So a prudent government would hesitate before committing billions of taxpayers' dollars to technologies that are not ready for prime time and likely to require permanent subsidies. At the heart of the decarbonization thesis are two claims. One is that the energy services that are needed by consumers can be electrified at reasonable cost. And the other is that hydrocarbons no longer can be used to generate electricity. Kent Zare, an Alberta engineer, analyzed the consequences if all of the vehicles in Canada were required to be zero-emission vehicles, generally meaning rechargeable electrical vehicles. At perfect efficiency, which is frankly impossible, more than 10,000 megawatts of additional generation capacity would be required just to power those vehicles. That's a problem, a big problem. The two largest power projects currently being constructed in Canada right now, Site C in British Columbia and Muskrat Falls in Labrador, have a combined generation capacity of 1,944 megawatts. So just to meet the electric vehicle-related increase in demand for power would require 8 more projects of the same size. It generally takes 15 to 20 years to take such a project from its initial planning stage to completion. Right now, there are 0 projects even being contemplated. Net zero advocates also insist that, apart from electricity, Canada must rely primarily, or even in some cases exclusively, upon wind and solar energy for incremental supply, notwithstanding that these are intermittent sources of electricity generation. Thus, natural gas, a resource that Canada holds in abundance, must be banned from use, even as a backup source of generation, and replaced by bulk electricity storage by batteries. Roger Andrews is a geophysicist with worldwide experience in energy and mining industries. He estimated that the combined wind and solar levelized cost of electricity with storage would be at least $700 per megawatt hour. Michael Kelly, a Cambridge University professor of engineering, estimates that the battery storage would cost 1,800 times more per day or 1,300 times per week more than backup diesel generators. Ken Gregory, an Alberta engineer, reviewed the capital cost estimates of completely electrifying the United States economy and found that it would be $433 trillion, 20 times the current GDP of the United States, largely due to the cost of storage. And that doesn't include the cost of additional generation, the cost of additional transmission capacity, the cost of new and upgrading substations, switching and control systems, and other equipment. In other words, the transformation of the electrical energy system would require enormous changes in terms of generation, transmission, and delivery. And the amount needed would make net zero not possible for many decades, if ever. I'll briefly mention here a few other technologies whose cost is much higher and feasibility much lower than is generally acknowledged. Cellulosic ethanol as a vehicle fuel, electrification of long-distance trucks, electrification of locomotives and rail freight systems, electrification of commercial aircraft, hydrogen produced from renewables, large-scale tidal power, and recovery of carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. My favorite on that list is electrification of air transport. The amount of battery storage that would be required to power a jet that crosses the Atlantic is now 6 times the maximum cargo weight of such a jet. In other words, decarbonization of air is not going to happen by 2050 or much after that. And trying to force it would mean the end of all travel and all air freight. It's not going to happen. The list of economic barriers to net zero is almost endless, but I'm going to focus upon 2 that have special relevance to Canada. Federal and provincial governments have already implemented over 300 different measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the most recently announced federal plan adds significantly more. The most economically damaging of all of them, I think, is the carbon dioxide pricing system, which includes both the carbon tax and the output-based pricing system, which is applied to industrial users. Based on the present schedule, the rate of the carbon tax will rise from $50 per ton now to $170 per ton by 2030, and it will go on rising considerably after that. Now, so industry does not get rebates. So the effect of these taxes and other charges is to worsen the competitiveness of the companies that are in emissions-intensive industries. Now, that's much more than just oil and gas. It's also mining, petrochemicals, aluminum, cement, steel, metal fabrication, and pulp and paper, just to mention a few. Those industries span right the entire country. And they're competing with plants in the United States, Mexico, and China that are facing carbon taxes of $4 per ton or less. How long will it be before those taxation rates will lead to a massive elimination or departure of investment and employment from Canada? The second economic barrier to net zero is one with which Albertans are altogether far too familiar, and that's the foregone revenues from canceled oil and gas infrastructure. And the list of projects that have been canceled is long and a depressing one. I'm thinking of the Northern Gateway Pipeline, the Energy East Pipeline, the Keystone XL Pipeline, the Tech Frontier Oil Sands Project, the Statoil Corner Oil Sands Project, Shell's Carmond Creek Oil Sands Project, the 3 LNG projects in British Columbia, to name just a few. The limitations on market access as a result of pipelines led to significant reductions in the cost of or price of heavy oil in the United States market. And that alone resulted in the loss of over $40 billion in revenue for Alberta producers in the period from 2012 to 2018. That's just the beginning. The Trudeau government wants to impose an absolute cap on oil and gas emissions, regardless of the size of the foregone income. The federal government's new environmental assessment and review regime just makes matters worse because it adds to the previous regime an approval in principle stage, and the key feature of which is a review of whether an additional energy infrastructure project will cause net zero goal to be imperiled. So let me translate that for you. If present policy stands, there will be no new oil sands projects. There will be no new oil and gas pipelines. There will be no major development of Canada's northern oil, gas, and mineral resources. In other words, if present policy holds, Canada will have to forego the economic development, trade, and revenue benefits of resources that are conservatively estimated to be worth more than $8 trillion. What other country in the world would do that? I'm going to talk now a little bit about materials constraints. In May 2021, the International Energy Agency issued a report on the role of critical minerals in what they considered to be the transition. It provided evidence of just how difficult and expensive it would be to have those materials in time. The IEA predicted that the demand for lithium would grow by 4,200%, that for graphite by 2,500%, for nickel by 1,900%, and for rare earth minerals by 700%. Tesla's goal of producing 20 million vehicles per year by 2030 alone requires 90% of today's graphite production, 50% of global cobalt production, plus the combined output of all of the most major nickel producers in the world. The world simply doesn't have the capacity to meet those materials requirements. Moreover, there are no plans to fund the construction of the needed mines and refineries. It takes about 16 years from initial decision to build a mine to actually have it completed, assuming that environmental objections and blockades don't stop it along the way. So if a decision were taken tomorrow to build a mine, it would come into production maybe by 2038. The minerals requirements that are currently associated with net zero, in other words, cannot be met until well after 2050, if then. The final and ultimately most important barrier to the pursuit of net zero may well be political. It's clear from the public debate that Canadian citizens have little idea of the scale and of the implications of the transition that's being planned for them over the next 28 years. It's not just a matter of costs and materials, although those will be unprecedented. It will also entail a disturbance to lifestyle and a reduction to our standard of living that is unprecedented as well. The rise in energy costs will result in an increase in energy poverty, especially among the elderly and those on fixed incomes. The government, in effect, is planning a major expansion in the central planning of the Canadian energy economy. That will limit or withdraw the freedoms that energy producers and consumers enjoy today. It will, I believe, place enormous and potentially fatal stresses on our federation. Politically, the central climate policy flaw is probably its cost. Opinion polls indicate that few Canadians are willing, let alone able, to spend a great deal more in order to deal with the costs of decarbonization. But yet, net zero will, according to studies done in the United Kingdom, lead to an increase in the cost per household in the range of $180,000 per year. How long will it take before we have our very own yellow vest movement? Climate policy has become a strange combination of central planning, exaltation of nature over humanity, and ideological absolutism. The internal contradictions, especially in terms of the use of numerous and contradictory policy instruments and the hostility to nuclear energy, should be obvious to all by now. From my perspective, as someone who has spent his entire professional life working as a policy analyst, the whole climate artifice is not just bad practice. It is unintentionally but surely designed to fail. Far too many Canadians have somehow been persuaded that climate change poses a moral issue and that they dare not depart from the mainstream view. We must persuade them that instead they should begin to think critically about climate as a practical public policy issue about which better choices are available. As I tried to show in my description of the global context, the cost borne by Canadians in pursuing net zero will achieve no measurable difference in terms of the climate. Going along is futile folly. Thank you very much for your time.
No, that's good. We'll have a question and answer at the end. We've got 3 more speakers, then we'll have a question and answer. So thank you very much for that enlightening presentation. I guess you'd say Patrick Moore spoke a couple years ago, and he said, if you look at it, a country's standard of living is inverse to the cost of food plus energy. And if you look at what Mr. Lyman is talking about here and increasing the cost of carbon, it's obviously going to increase the cost of energy and the cost of food, which ultimately will lead to a lower standard of living for all of us. So let's hope we can figure a way out of from where we're at to where we're hoping to go. So we have now Francis Menton, who if I'm not mistaken, is talking about I think sort of how many batteries it would take to keep the lights on. Is he there? Oh, there you are, right there. Welcome to Calgary. How are you? Can we hear you?
I'm great. Can you hear
There
me?
you are. Well, we can hear you, and I'll sit down, and you can talk, and you've got about 20 minutes, and then we have 2 more presenters after that, and then we'll have a question and answer if you can stay on for the question and answer. The question and answer is going to be from 4:30 till 5. So you've got 20 minutes, so good luck. We're ready to listen, okay? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Happy Earth Day to all. And thank you for having me for this presentation today. I think the title of my talk is when net zero hits the math. So there will be some math in this talk, but actually none beyond the arithmetic that you learned by about the 6th grade. So and nothing that people can't really keep track of in their heads. I say people can't keep track of in their heads. Our leaders don't seem to be able to be. April 22, which is today, is just 1 year from the day that the United States became committed to net zero, or as our president calls it, zero carbon pollution. And that was accomplished exactly 1 year ago today. I bet few people in the audience will know how the United States took that on as a national commitment. The answer is it was done by a presidential press release on April 22, 2021, not even an executive order, let alone an action of Congress. And by that press release, the United States is to eliminate all carbon pollution from its electricity grid by 2035 and from its economy by 2050. So what is the strategy? How do they plan to do that? The funny thing is they don't have any kind of detailed engineering plan. They don't have any kind of feasibility studies. They don't have any demonstration projects. And if you want to listen to President Biden talk, it would appear to be simply a question of building enough wind turbines and solar panels until we can provide all the electricity. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Germany faced a sudden energy crisis because of the Russian gas situation, Biden made a remark, which was, wouldn't it have been great if they had just built enough wind turbines? So that's been the strategy so far, and that is the strategy going forward, just build more wind turbines. But what happens if you just keep building more wind turbines and then you try to withdraw the hydrocarbon electricity generation that we currently have? And this is the math issue that we are going to hit. In this, I'm going to follow on some of the things that Mr. Lyman said, because he actually talked about some of the work of people like Roger Andrews and Ken Gregory, who have done some of the detailed arithmetic and spreadsheets to show how this works. So let's think about what happens if you just keep building more and more wind turbines and solar panels. Well, if you have hydrocarbon power plants, they pretty much produce energy when you want the energy. If you have usage for a year, and the US usage for a year of electricity is in the range of 4,000 terawatt hours, you have that usage for a year, you just build enough power plants, build in a little bit of excess, and you've got it covered. Now talk about wind and solar generators. Wind and solar generators produce on average in a combined system about 30% of capacity, and they only produce it when the wind blows or when the sun shines. So if you build nameplate capacity of wind and solar turbines, which would seem to be equal to the consumption of a country, you're only going to get over the course of the year about 30% of the electricity that the country needs. Where are you going to get the rest? Well, you have a whole hydrocarbon electricity system out there already. You just have to keep it. You have to keep it all. So if you build that amount of wind turbines and solar panels, you're going to get about 30% of your electricity from the wind and sun and about 70% from the hydrocarbons. Okay, double your wind and sun. See how that works. What happens now? The amount of electricity that you're going to get over the year from the wind and sun will now be about 60% of what you need. Unfortunately, a lot of it is going to come at a time when you can't use it. And in fact, Germany is an example of a country that has overbuilt its wind and sun system. And so where they are today is not infrequently, they have electricity they can't use. They have to give it away to Poland, or even pay Poland to take it. They haven't gotten as far as building double capacity of wind and solar. But even if you get up to building double capacity of wind and solar, you can't get the percentage of your electricity from the wind and sun up to 50% on a regular basis, because you have so much of the time that the power you're generating is excess, and you have so much of the time that your system is generating nothing. Try to triple it, try to quadruple it. You can't get to a point of all of your electricity from the wind and sun because you're generating so much excess, and you still have the problem of the calm night, of which there are a lot in the year, when the wind and the sun together produce nothing. If the hypothesis is you have to get rid of the hydrocarbon generation, and that is the hypothesis that the United States appears to be committed to, and that Canada appears to be committed to, and that's the hypothesis, what is the answer? And the answer is storage. Now, somebody might say nuclear, but nuclear seems to be unacceptable also and regulatorily constrained in both the US and Canada. Hydro, there's not enough of it. And most of it's already developed in the US, less so in Canada, but there's not enough of it. You have to get the storage. And then you have to calculate how much storage you're going to need. And this is where the work of people like Ken Gregory and Roger Andrews comes in, because they have done hour-by-hour studies of what a wind solar system designed to produce all the electricity you need and backed up only by storage, what does that look like? So I have asked for a couple of charts to be put together to include in my presentation, and I wonder if somebody has, if they don't have them, I will proceed without it, but I wonder if somebody has a first chart, which is basically a very squiggly red line across the page. I'm gonna keep talking in anticipation that that might come up. But the chart that I'm talking about is one that was put together by Mr. Gregory. I understand he's actually from Alberta, although I've never met him, from Calgary. And it shows the pattern of wind and solar generation over the year, wildly swinging up and down from much more than you need down to close to zero, up and down. There you go. In the horizontal x-axis side here, what you see are hours. So it represents a whole year, and the numbers are hours. The significance of that is that there are 8,760 hours in a year, and this is an hour-by-hour chart of what the pattern of the generation of electricity by the existing wind and sun system in the United States for the year 1920. You can 2020, I'm sorry, and you can see it swinging wildly up and down. When you eyeball the chart, it does not terribly appear that there's a seasonality inherent in it. It doesn't really leap out at the eye. I should mention that approximately hour 4400 would be about July 1, about the middle of the year. So and the last it's 720 hours in a month, so the last little under 1,000 would be December, for example. So the seasonality doesn't really leap out at you, but look a little closer and you will see that the periods when the wind and sun are generating toward the highest levels, up towards 600 gigawatts in this chart, that tends to be about March, April, May into June. By the time you're in July, you're in a summer wind drought that goes all the way to September, and you have another drought that comes about in November and December, and then it continues in January and February in this chart. What is the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is now try to make this chart, which Mr. Gregory also did. Make a chart where each day you calculate the additions or the subtractions to storage, so that if your wind solar system, which produces the exact amount of energy you need for the year, if that system generates more than is consumed in a day, you add to the storage. And if it generates less, you draw from the storage. And you look at the pattern that will give you over the course of the year. And that's the second chart that I have. And this, again, I've taken from the work of Ken Gregory in Alberta. And now the seasonality is extremely obvious. This is simply derived from that previous chart, but you can see that the batteries are building up from approximately March to beginning of July. And then they are drawn down from approximately July until October. And then they start to build up again. They level off. There's actually some shrinkage in January, February into March. And then from March to July, they build up again. And by the way, this particular chart is just based on the actual pattern of wind and sun in the weather that occurred in 2019 and 20 in the United States. It's taken from data that comes from, I believe, that same Energy Information Administration that Mr. Lyman was talking about. And now when you look at this chart, you see some very dramatic things. First of all, you're going to need 250,000 gigawatt hours of battery storage. It's it's and that's to make it through a year without having a blackout. It's difficult to conceive of exactly how much battery storage that is. A Tesla battery is approximately 100 kilowatt hours, and they charge about $10,000 to $15,000 for that. $10,000 to $15,000 for that. Well, if you were to multiply that out to get enough batteries here, if you assume this could be done with Tesla batteries, well, that's going to be on the order of 25 or more trillion dollars, which is more than the GDP of the U.S. But Mr. Gregory rightly points out that Tesla battery, you're not buying everything in a Tesla battery that this battery system would need to have. For example, a battery produces direct current, the grid uses alternating current, so you have to have converters back and forth, you have to have transformers, you have to have a whole physical infrastructure to put these things in, you have to have temperature control for them. And so Mr. Gregory uses a number of more like $400 per gigawatt hour, which is in accord with EIA data of how much you would have to pay for such batteries with all that infrastructure. And he gets a number in excess of $100 trillion. And then I think Mr. Lyman mentioned a number of 400 trillion that he ultimately comes from. And that of course comes from electrifying the whole economy. So this chart, which comes with this enormous 250,000 gigawatt hours of battery storage, is only to electrify the current amount of electricity usage in the U.S. It doesn't include electrifying automobiles. It doesn't include electrifying buildings. It doesn't include electrifying home heat, freight transportation, agriculture, industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how Mr. Gregory comes up with the $400 trillion number. It's almost a surplusage to say this is never going to happen. The real question is, when does it hit the wall? It is only a question of time until when it hits the wall, because right now they are embarked on a program of building more and more wind turbines, more and more solar panels. They don't even have an idea of what kind of battery might be able to do this. And I just want to point out that if you look at this chart, the 250,000 gigawatts has to be built up over the course of 6 months and discharged over the course of 6 months. Tesla batteries can't do that. There is no existing battery that can do that. There's no existing battery that can hold on to charge for 6 months without losing any of it, which is assumed in this chart. And there aren't even pilot programs of batteries being developed at this point, let alone feasibility studies or demonstration projects of some kind of battery that could accomplish this task. It is a complete, total fantasy. So that is where net zero hits the math. Where and when it hits the math, when they start closing down, perfectly good natural gas power plants, and suddenly nothing works anymore and everything goes black, that's when it hits the math. I don't know exactly when that will be, but I do know that we are never getting to net zero on a battery storage model. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, for entering a long list of people who have been depressing this afternoon. But in any event, appreciate your effort. I guess we'll be well informed and depressed. But if you can stay with us, we do have some good news, and we got Catherine Swift will be speaking shortly. But the good news is our last speaker before supper is Michael Binnion, and he always has good news. I mean, I guess he's one of those entrepreneurs that made the energy industry what it is he can take bad news and turn it into good news and electricity, hopefully. So anyway, if you don't mind staying with us, we'll have a question and answer in about 40 minutes, friends. But thank you. I don't know if you could hear the applause, but you got a round warm of applause for your depressing speech. Okay.
Thank you. And I may step away for a minute, but I will be here at, is it 4:30 your time and 6:30 mine?
4:35 our time. Yes, 4:35 our time. We'll have a short question and answer. Thank you very much. It's well appreciated, even though we're joking about it. Thank you. So, yes. So do we have David, or David, do we have Catherine Swift on deck? And yes, we do have Catherine. How are you? Can you
Thanks,
hear?
Danny.
Good. Nice to see you. We're, well, that nice smiling face. We're looking forward to your presentation. Catherine used to be with, I think, with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, was it? Now you're with the Ontario Manufacturers Association, and you've been at our conferences before. We've always enjoyed you, and we're looking forward to hearing you today. So without further ado, welcome, and go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Danny, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. It just wasn't feasible. But I have been there in person at a couple of your previous conferences, and I know they're always a lot of fun. And yes, I am now, my relatively new gig is the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. The organization has only been around for a few years and basically represents small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses, as well as other businesses, mostly Ontario-based, but we also have membership elsewhere in Canada, and we're growing. So we want to become more national in the time ahead. The topic for today, or my topic, is the business of net zero. And given the developments in Europe and whatnot, I've started to call it niet zero because as you've heard from previous presentations, the concept of net zero is pretty unattainable. And given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think niet zero is a pretty apropos name. Our business members are extremely alarmed with developments in the energy sector and the economy in general these days, where we see reliable, affordable fossil fuel energy sources being disadvantaged by policy and dramatically increasing the costs of that energy to businesses and consumers, and also adding to the very expensive red tape that businesses have to contend with. And overall, of course, we reduce the competitiveness of the Canadian economy. And of course, these trends are not being driven by free markets. They're being driven by ideological government policy that they supposedly justify by this need to fight climate change. And in Canada, the oil and gas sector is, of course, being vilified by the current federal government and some provinces as well. Unless seemingly you're in a region that still retains a number of Liberal seats. I found it very intriguing recently that the Bay du Nord project off the coast of Newfoundland was approved, a very large offshore oil project. And yet similar size projects in Alberta continue to be stymied. So obviously only Liberals need apply for these major projects. And what it does show is the hypocrisy of our federal government, that they can approve a project in a more politically friendly area, even though they supposedly care about these climate issues. But overall, in Canada, the industry represents about 10% of our GDP, about 20% of our exports, pays between $10 and $20 billion annually in taxes to governments, and employs over 500,000 people. So to treat such an important industry so badly is foolish public policy. And this is especially true considering that the Canadian industry is a world leader in energy, innovation, and technology. And I know that Michael Binnion is going to talk more about that. But we are truly a leader, and that should be both recognized more often and more effectively deployed to export that kind of innovative technology around the world. It's also interesting that an awful lot of Canadians continue to believe that policies that hurt the energy sector are only a problem for Alberta and Saskatchewan, perhaps, but mostly for Alberta, not realizing the very heavy reliance on oil and gas for businesses of all sizes and all regions, and the jobs that they provide right across the country. And many of our Ontario members at the Coalition supply materials to the oil and gas sector, and they're greatly affected by the fortunes of the industry. We also find that far too many business groups, the various business associations, are going along with these harmful government policies even though they seriously hurt the members of these business groups. Now, of course, you got to realize that most of these business groups are dependent on government subsidies of one kind or another, so they don't want to rock the boat. And it's becoming increasingly clear that much of the climate alarmism driving these punitive policies is based on information that is not factual. And I've managed to hear most of the conference today, and I think a number of the speakers have demonstrated just how very problematic that is, that we're making significant policy changes based on bad information. Also, things like theoretical models that have never been accurate in predicting the future, and also the false promises about all of the supposed benefits of going green, all of those green jobs that are going to be created and yet never materialize. Particularly problematic for businesses is the increasing application of this so-called ESG scoring approach, or standards, environmental, social, and governance, to determine the financing eligibility of businesses. And it's got a lot of traction in financial circles around the world these days. ESG has all kinds of problems. Any policy, for starters, that spawns an army of consultants, advisors, accountants, and so on, merely to enforce it and put it in place, that's a very unproductive use of resources to have that immense number of advisors to deal with this very complicated policy. The red tape involved with ESG is also very significant and tends to be more punitive for the small and medium-sized business sector than the large corporate sector. And ESG is also very arbitrary, subjective, tends to mean different things in different industries, different regions, and different countries. It also encourages businesses to cook up ways of gaming the system, and can have very perverse impacts. And for example, there was a recent news story that the main Canadian banks, all of whom have signed on to Mark Carney's Net Zero Banking Alliance, they're all having conflicts between the climate activists and the ESG investors, and the reality that in Canada, the oil and gas sector is a significant part of our economy, and therefore the banks are going to be exposed to that sector of necessity. So that's been something that, even though they signed on to this, I wonder if they really knew what they were signing on to. Another perverse impact of ESG we've seen in spades with the Russian invasion of Ukraine recently. And Russia actually attracted a great deal of investment, foreign investment, into its energy sector because it tended to rank fairly well on the prevailing ESG criteria. But of course, that doesn't factor in the kind of geopolitical elements that, as we've seen lately, all that investment has enabled Russia to commit heinous crimes in Ukraine. And that, of course, wasn't something that I think was foreseen by many people either. We've seen a lot of investment funds, such as, for example, Brookfield Asset Management, and that Mark Carney's a vice chair there. They've been found to be engaged in so-called greenwashing. Basically, Carney claimed the firm had achieved net zero across its investment portfolio, but it was actually found substantial coal, oil sands, and pipeline assets in the mix. So that was a little lie that Carney told about that. I saw a great quote from Jordan Peterson recently that I thought I'd read. And he was speaking, you might know he stepped down from his tenured, protected professor position at U of T recently because he couldn't handle the woke climate there. And he refers to it as DIE, diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And the quote is, if you think die is bad, wait until you get a load of ESG scores. Purporting to assess corporate moral responsibility, these scores, which can dramatically affect an enterprise's financial viability, are nothing less than the equivalent of China's damnable social credit system applied to the entrepreneurial and financial world. CEOs, what in the world is wrong with you? Can you see that the ideologues who push such appalling nonsense are driven by an agenda that is not only absolutely antithetical to your free market enterprise, but is precisely targeted at the freedoms that made your success possible? Can't you see that by going along sheep-like, just as the professors are doing, just as the artists and writers are doing, that you are generating a veritable fifth column within your business? Are you really so blind, cowed, and cowardly? And he never minces words, as we know, Jordan Peterson. We know that we've developed a whole new vocabulary these days, whether it be Build Back Better, the Great Reset, modern monetary theory, net zero, ESG, energy poverty, and so on. And I'm sure you're familiar with all of those. Well, I'm an economist by background, and I was especially intrigued by this popularity of modern monetary theory. And what supposedly it professed was that basically governments can spend as much money as they want, and there won't be a problem with triggering inflation. Well, guess what? Given what we've seen regarding inflation in the last few months, it's not too surprising, even though the lefties loved this whole concept of, within a couple of years back. We don't seem to hear too much about modern monetary theory these days, because as usual, the rules of economics do apply. They haven't magically changed, and governments spending like mad indeed have triggered the massive inflation that we're seeing in Canada and also in other countries around the world. The net zero thrust is not just affecting economies, but of course geopolitics, and the Russian example is a very good case in point. But also China's Belt and Road Initiative is buying up very valuable mining and other resource assets worldwide, including in Canada, to increase the developed world's reliance on its supplies of these vital minerals. And the previous presenter mentioned some of those rare earth metals, for example, that are included. As we saw in the Glasgow COP26 climate summit just late last year, these dangerous regimes, they have no intention of inflicting on themselves the kind of foolish policies the Western world is pursuing that weaken their economies and weaken our democracies too. So what do we need to do? And again, I think this is in sync with some of the previous speakers. I've been calling it the Great Pushback. We need the Great Pushback to counter the Great Reset. And thankfully, that pushback has begun in a number of quarters, but we need it to build much more momentum in future. We're starting to see an awful lot of experts who were originally on the climate bandwagon, people like Michael Schellenberger, a former International Panel on Climate Change advisor, Steve Koonin, who was a former Obama administration science advisor. In Sweden, Bjorn Lomborg has some very sensible climate suggestions. And here in Canada, Patrick Moore, who I understand is speaking tomorrow, a co-founder of Greenpeace, also presents an awful lot of sensible arguments questioning the conventional wisdom, so-called conventional wisdom of the Zero movement. And what's interesting is all of these people, they acknowledge the facts of climate change, but they're moderating influences that propose much more reasonable ways of dealing with climate issues that are not punishing to our way of life and our standard of living. Permit less developed countries to continue to use oil and gas to reduce poverty, as they've been doing for decades now, and also acknowledge our continued need for fossil fuels for the foreseeable future while pursuing other sensible technological developments. We also have to ensure that all of the downsides of these green policies are evaluated and communicated much better than they are now, as well as any possible upsides. And we need to publicize inconvenient truths like the fact that Canada's emissions have increased since 2015, since the Trudeau government was first elected, despite all the new taxes and other costs that have been inflicted on businesses and average consumers and families. Just this week, we saw that yet again, Canada failed to achieve its emission targets for 2020. And both Trudeau and, at the time, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna said that, we are definitely going to meet those targets, no doubt about it. Well, no, it didn't happen. And yet, despite this yet another failure, because they've never been met, the targets have never been met, despite that other failure, the Trudeau government recently doubled down and announced even more draconian emissions targets supposedly for 2030. So we really need a reckoning with the truth with this agenda. We also need to be proactive in proposing alternatives that would work better for the environment, actually achieve tangible results, and be less punitive to businesses and individuals. And I think the plastics industry has done quite a good job of laying out you don't ban a handful of plastics like the Trudeau government has done, which is a virtue signaling exercise, not an effective way to do it. But you show that you can recycle plastics, you can reuse plastics, and it's essential, the essential role that plastics play. We sure saw that in spades during the pandemic in the healthcare system, that are not replaceable. So the notion of having this simplistic ban is just foolish policy that doesn't help the environment and actually hurts citizens in many ways. We also need to bring back manufacturing to North America instead of offshoring it to jurisdictions that have much less rigorous environmental and human rights standards than we do, and oppose the kinds of policies that discourage new resource, pipeline, and other industrial projects. I heard an expression recently that this whole approach to no new development, and they called it the banana policy, which stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And of course, that's utterly ridiculous. Economies have to grow; they have to continue to develop, and we need to dispel the notion of the banana policies. We also, of course, need a return to freer markets and the productive businesses, the businesses that actually create something. They're not dependent upon subsidies from governments. They actually contribute to the bottom line, create sensible, well-paid jobs, and provide the tax dollars that underwrite the social services that we all value. And we need to reverse the big government crony capitalist anti-free market approach that has dominated in recent years. Throughout history, we've seen the pendulum of ideas and policies swing back and forth between different ideologies and different kinds of policy approaches. And back in the 80s, we saw a period very much in favor of free enterprise. Leaders internationally like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, here in Canada, Brian Mulroney, with more open trading arrangements promoted around the world, freer markets, less intrusive governments, and the result was dramatic reductions in global poverty and rising standards of living. In recent years, of course, the pendulum has swung back toward a more leftist approach, a renewed support for big government and even socialism, without the understanding of history and the many horrors that big government and socialism have created. The pandemic, of course, has exacerbated this trend because the dependence on government was necessarily temporarily increased during that crisis. But now it's high time the pendulum swung back toward more policies based on facts, common sense, personal freedom, and a maximization of the welfare of the majority of people, not simply the elite. And at our coalition of manufacturers and businesses, we're going to be fighting to achieve this pendulum swing. And the great pushback needs more momentum from everyone. And although it'll always be easier to go along to get along, in my many years of advocating for small and medium-sized businesses with governments, financial institutions, and others, I have always found that if you're nice to the cannibals, they might eat you last. Thanks very much.
Thanks for ending on an optimistic note, Catherine. We'll let Michael speak. That was very interesting. We'll let Michael speak, and then we'll have a question and answers. Can you stay around for the question and answer? It sounds like you've been here. Yes, exactly. Fair enough. Okay, that's good. So, well, our next speaker is Michael Binnion. I don't know if you were here, Michael, when I made my introductory remarks this morning, but I said, well, for one thing, Michael is the founder of the Modern Miracle Network. It's the Modern Miracle of Oil, and he's been a good sponsor of our organization, both at this conference and previously. And as I pointed out then, one of the things that we're trying to do is have a respectful discussion from all sides of the spectrum so we know what our options are. And I don't think there's any group in Alberta or Canada that does a better job of that than the Modern Miracle, of bringing together a whole host of people who are not necessarily working on the same projects. I always say, we're all fighting the same war, but we can't all be in every battle together. But yet we're sort of a group of, like-minded people trying to build a better province, a better industry, and a better country. So you always seem to have an optimistic look at how the world should go, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much for joining us.
Okay. Well, Danny, that's very nice, and I have to tell you that I've been coming to this conference with my wife Maria, who's here for some years, and I remember one of the very first ones. Danny said it's really a grandparents for freedom type group, you know, and of course I wasn't a grandparent at the time, but I am now, and so I relate to it a bit more, and I will have to tell you, you know, it's grandchildren are just one of the few things that makes growing older a little bit better, and. And I have to tell you, as I watch my kids try to raise my grandparents, they really, truly are a parent's revenge. Danny's had a lot of courage here. This is a conference where cancel culture is not allowed, and he's been able to keep it out here. So I always enjoy the frank speakers and people willing to speak their minds here. I mean, and Danny, he went along with this conference right at the very beginning of COVID. I think it was one of the only conferences that happened in that first 12 months. And I have to tell you, I'm a little bit surprised that you're not locked up as a pastor right now. But anyways, so I heard talk about bold conversations on energy. I'm Michael Binnion, and I'm busy. I work every day to end smog in China, done cooking fires in India, waterborne disease in Africa, First Nations poverty in Canada, to reduce global emissions and provide energy security to the world. That's what I do. My company produces a miraculous product that does all that. And so today I hope I can answer 3 questions. 1, are people's lives better globally with Canadian hydrocarbons? 2, how did that ever become a question? And 3, what are we going to do about it? So Modern Miracle Network was formed by citizens who wanted to have a reasoned conversation on energy and our choices. We have a multi-partisan approach and an all of the above approach because we need all our energy choices. But at the same time, we think it's time to stop comparing the benefits of one kind of energy to the impacts of another. After all, every grade 3 student knows that a benefit's better than an impact. And all energy, even renewables, have serious impacts. And it turns out hydrocarbons have some pretty important benefits, truly miraculous benefits, like ending waterborne disease in Africa. And who in their right mind would want to ban a modern miracle? And so in a reasoned conversation, we would compare the costs and the benefits of all of our energy choices to put up the best energy in its best place and to create a better, balanced energy diet. So today I want to tell you how I've changed my mind on energy and Alberta and Canada's role in the world, and to maybe be a little bit optimistic that I think with a change in perspective and a change of the question that we might be able to do a little better than the previous speakers suggested. But first, I have to tell you, I have been discouraged for years. As some of you might know, my company discovered a giant gas field in Quebec. It's 20 TCF of gas. Just to put that in perspective, it would be enough to replace 1/2 of Russian exports of natural gas to Germany. We received, for finding that, a temporary moratorium in 2011. Not sure if you can guess who the premier was at the time. But in reaction to it, we re-engineered our whole project, both from a social license point of view and a project design point of view. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, but we came up with a project that would be able to produce natural gas, primarily using hydroelectricity with 0 emissions, but also that we could sell that to an industrial hub and be able to capture and recycle or store those emissions to create a world's first 0 emissions production, 0 emissions consumption of natural gas. We made a deal with the local landowners, the local farmers, the local town, and somewhat recently just with the local First Nations. And everything that the government told us to do to achieve social license, reduce impacts, so on and so forth. And multiple polls have showed that less than 15% of people are against that project with all of those features. Less than 50%. More people in Quebec vote for Quebec Solidaire, 20%, than are against our project. And so the reward we got for redoing all of that was the local government just recently revoked our permits for no compensation, although he says he'll give us some of our money back, perhaps. And it tells us that what we're up against with people is not just genuine environmentalists. And Tammy Nebus I'm going to mention her a couple times. She's going to talk about this tomorrow. The people against us, against our industry, are made up, I think, of three groups. One is true believers. I think there's genuine reasons to be concerned about a future environment with 10 billion people living on the planet. But the other groups are socialists who just want big government solutions and jump on the issue. This is like in the 1910s, worker rights, the solution was communism. In the 1960s, the equal rights, the solution was socialism. And now here we are in 2010, global environment, the solution once again is big government. And then the third group is opportunists. And I can tell you, I don't think that the pragmatic environmentalists are against us in Quebec. I don't think the people of Quebec are against us. I think it is socialists and opportunists that are against us in Quebec. Oops, I've done something wrong, I think. So, I know that I'm not the only one who's discouraged. I know you're discouraged too. And it's because it feels like people haven't been listening to us. People haven't been listening to Westerners. People haven't been listening to Albertans. People haven't been listening to the oil and gas industry. And we know we are making an important contribution. We know that we're trying to do the best we can for ourselves, our families, and for Canada. And we're frustrated that Canadians just don't seem to know the facts. They don't seem to care. We've got foreign-funded groups against us. And we've now got global investors questioning whether you can even invest in our province. So what I want to talk about there in terms of that is what we can do now. But first, I just want to talk about a couple of numbers, and that's 15 million in 2019. So Modern Miracle, we started in 2015, and I like to say that before that, I think we were playing with no goalies in the net. And we had opponents that were very well funded, very sophisticated. But I want to point out that we started in 2015, and that their funding has continued to increase. The average funding per the top 20 NGOs, it's 15 million per year. That's the top NGOs per each. And the other number, 2019, is the amount of money that they raised during an election year. And that was, as you recall, was an election year. And you can see there how much money the parties raised in an election year, which would be their best year for fundraising, and that the top 20 NGOs raised more money than all of them put together in that year. So I think important for us to understand that, I've been discouraged. I think you've been discouraged. We have to understand our opponents, they're not stopping. And in fact, their revenues keep going up. So what I want to talk about is, why is this recent conversation important? And I'll tell you, one of them is that it's the difference between a recession and a depression. We all know that a recession is when you lose your job, and a depression is when I lose my job. Well, we're sitting here in Alberta, so if we lose this discussion, we're going to lose our jobs. So it's going to be a depression for us. So that's the number one reason. But I think maybe a more important reason is Canada, I think, is at an inflection point in our history. And I think Ukraine did not cause this. I think Ukraine revealed it for many. For 150 years, our country has been a loyal junior partner who can always be counted on to punch above our weight, first to Britain, then United States, then United Nations, more recently to whoever might want to have us. But we have to realize that that is not the United States anymore. Through Obama blocking XL Pipeline, Trump reopening NAFTA, Biden shutting down the pipeline again, we can be sure the special relationship is really over. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it doesn't matter. And Trump had, even ended the decades-long symbolic tradition of visiting Canada first. And we have to understand, Americans assume that Canadians stand up for themselves, just like Americans stand up for themselves. And they're more than happy to have a stranglehold on our oil and to buy it cheaper and to have the only access to it, if we're willing to let that happen. But I think right now, Canada, after 150 years, we're in a position to become a senior partner, no longer the junior partner. Step up a weight class, take advantage of our competitive advantages in the world, which is our massive resources with very few people who need them, our world-leading environmental technology and practices, our reliability as a responsible supplier, and our geographic position with the shortest trade routes to 3 of the 4 of the world's largest economies. We've seen that when Russia, who has all of those resources in Siberia, much like another Canada, when they become unreliable, Canada can be the supplier of resources of last resort. We can keep the world running even in the middle of a war. So I believe we have to win this culture war over oil and gas because we're consequential in the world. We have the resources the world wants, and we're the best in the world at it. While the 20th century belonged to our senior partners, there's no reason the 21st century can't belong to Canada. Stepping up a weight class, selling our valuable resources to the largest economies in the world, who are happy to have us as an honest and reliable supplier and willing to pay the top price for that. But there's one reason, actually. As international nice guys, we haven't figured out how to stand up to the Tides Foundation and their zealots. As was mentioned before, their narrative started in the 1970s with Morris Strong. And I'll tell you, just because we're in a grandparents group, I'll tell you, I remember I was in school in the 1970s and Pierre Trudeau was saying that we have to stop hewing wood and drawing water for our American cousins. We need to join the new economy, at that time was manufacturing. We need to do in value add. And this is a narrative that's been around for those 50 years. And at those days, oil and gas was going to run out and we were going to replace it with fission and fusion. And everybody was sure of it. I was sure of it. I didn't go into oil and gas. I went into high tech for the first 20 years of my career because I thought oil and gas would run out. But what happened was oil and gas went through a complete transformation, completely transformed its technology, was able to find massive new amounts of resources around the world, including the oil sands as just one example, to make that economic. And we were able to continue to provide those resources on a reliably and affordable basis. And fusion is still farther away than we thought it was in the 1970s. And what I want to tell you about a little bit today is I think we're on the cusp of another major transformation for our industry, just like that. So I think it's time for us to stand up to tides and just realize that there's absolutely nothing wrong with hewing wood and drawing water when you're the world's best at it. So I think one reason people haven't listened to the facts is that facts don't sell. Telling people to get educated on energy literacy doesn't sell. People don't know how many millions there are in a billion, most of us. And perhaps I should say under just inflation, maybe we don't know how many billions there are in a trillion. I think we need to give people something to believe in us, reasons to trust us. And I think when people know what we care about, they'll care more about those facts. Modern Miracle has been about these belief statements. One is Canadians are the best in the world at developing resources, and the world needs more of us. I think that's never been clearer. When respectfully involved, First Nations, the majority of First Nations, actually support resource development. Oil and gas saves lives, makes your life better. We're Canadians, just like you. 600,000 families across the country living in communities just like ours make their living directly or indirectly from the energy industry. And the other one, which I'm going to introduce you today, is that there's a third option for climate. Emerging carbon tech is advancing rapidly and is creating a pathway to net zero, not energy transition, energy transformation. I think that we're stuck in a 20th century false choice. It's an outdated choice. From John Robson's talk this morning, it's a bad idea, it's wrong thinking. But it was true in the 1970s that we had this choice between these two charts. So if the one on your left, that's the number of, the share of people. And it's, to me, this is just an absolutely incredible thing to think that in 1800 with 1 billion people, over 90% of them were not getting 2,000 calories a day. Everybody was living in 90% living in abject poverty. Today, that number is well under 10%. So what we've done is we've gone from 1 billion people to 7.6 billion people. And that number of people in abject poverty has fallen. The percentage has fallen dramatically. It is a modern miracle. This is all because of technology and oil and gas, hydrocarbons. Now, on the other side is a representation of another problem. That's a mirror image, and it's CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, I want to say, especially for this crowd, that it's a representation of that's one environmental factor. But I think when we do our reports with the life cycle analysis, CRIG at Polytechnique Montreal, they have set 16 environmental factors, and emissions is one of them. we all should be working to make an impact on all 16 of them, not just the one. But I think also, hopefully, that we can all agree that 10 billion people in 2050, which is nearly certain at this point, will definitely create environmental pressure. We've seen the pressure with smog in Britain and industrial cities in China today. We've seen water contamination has become a problem. We saw the problems in forestry and fisheries and freshwater. So we understand more people creates pressure on the environment. There is no doubt there will be more pressure on our environment in 2050 on all of those 16 factors, including emissions. I think it's time to stop arguing about the details of accuracy of models and all recognize there's an environmental pressure coming and we should all be trying to do something about it. So I think this idea of net zero is only impossible if you assume the 20th century question. I was a tax accountant actually for some time, and one of my mentor, he said to me, he says, Michael, if you're getting the wrong tax result for your client, you need to change the assumptions. So that was always a joke, of course, because the tax, basically he was saying change the facts. So I think here we have to change the question. And I think the way we change the question is to start thinking about oil and gas being low emissions energy and a sustainable energy source. So what I've got is what if all these activists from the 1970s, and by the way, thinking of 20th century, I have to tell you, I think the activists, thank you. You rung an alarm bell. You're right. The population's growing. You're right. There's a future environmental problems coming. We need to address those. So thank you. But you've not had a new idea in 50 years. All you can do is ban, block, and protest. So you've won. But it's time to now move on with solutions. And I think there's a convergence on that with industry, with pragmatic NGOs, all believing that there is technological solutions for this problem. And so while these arguments go on about accuracy of models and predictions, I don't think anybody is really arguing seriously more about these problems, but we need some new ideas. We need 21st century solutions to them. And I think that's carbon tech. So what's carbon tech? There's a wiki page on that, so you can check it out there. But it basically is taking those circular economy concepts and applying it directly to oil and gas. And it's private market solutions to these environmental problems. It is reduced by modern SCADA, new, better equipment. The application, which is happening right now, of artificial intelligence and machine learning and Internet of Everything to the way we do oil and gas. Constant improvement of efficiencies to reduce the amount of emissions that are created, both in the production and the use of hydrocarbons. The new one that has just been emerging, but it's based on organic chemistry. I like to say organic chemistry is really cool. CO2 can be, so if you take a hydrocarbon molecule, so the simplest one, methane, CH4, if you split it, free energy comes out, heat. And you get some CO2 and some H2O, you get carbon dioxide and water. If you take that same carbon dioxide and water and you put energy back in, you can make a hydrocarbon again. Earth does it naturally, easily, all the time. It's constantly recycling CO2 into all kinds of interesting things like forests and people and many other things, right? It's possible, organic chemistry, all very well understood, absolutely possible for us to build a plant, inputs of carbon dioxide, water, other chemicals as needed, and energy, and create products. The problem, of course, has been economics. It's not been a problem of science. We heard earlier about the problems of the science of batteries. We do not have a problem with the science of organic chemistry. It's well understood. It's very possible to do this. So that's reuse. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the third one is return, and we've heard a lot about that. That's capturing that same carbon dioxide. It's returning it under the ground. And so through that, it is technically feasible, not economically feasible today, but it's absolutely technically feasible for us to make oil and gas zero emissions. We can reduce, recycle, and we can return those emissions under the ground. Where it starts with is creating, and this is starting to happen in Europe. There's a few projects proposed here in Canada. Nobody has realized this hub yet, but I can tell you that because my own company has engineered it. I fervently believe that these zero emissions hubs are possible. Starts with a zero emissions hub, then how do you connect them together? So I'll go start here with a couple diagrams, maybe too small for you to see, but one of those is my own company's diagram, which is to say we've got an oil and gas discovery less than 10 kilometers from an industrial hub. So instead of just putting a gas line to the industrial hub, our idea is we'll put a gas line and a CO2 line. We'll sell the gas to the industrial hub, burn the gas or convert it into hydrogen, capture those emissions, recycle them into, our plan was cement additives, because of all the dozens and dozens of technologies happening being commercialized right now for converting carbon into products, cement additives are the ones that are the most economic. Close to economic was zero carbon price, so we were going to do cement additives. The rest of it we were going to take back in that CO2 line, back to our gas, store it under the ground right below where we produce the gas from. So that was, and we were using hydroelectricity to produce it with low to zero emissions too. So zero emission production, and through this, at that hub, in that industrial hub, zero emissions consumption as well. Frog Lake in Alberta has got a similar idea there. They're planning to incorporate solar and wind into a project, but it will be another zero emissions hub. There's the ethylene project from Dow in Alberta today is another example of that. The big picture, which people in Europe are talking about, we're listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange, is that once you create those hubs, their plan is we'll re-pipeline the continent. Hydrogen line, CO2 line, gas line, and every pipeline right away. Everybody will be connected to all three. I can use gas, put the CO2 in a line. I can take the CO2 out of the line and either store it or recycle it into products. Or if I need zero emissions energy, I just take the hydrogen out of the line. So and the hydrogen produced from the gas. So that then creates something I think easily achievable by 2050, if we decide to do it, something that would be zero emissions oil and gas, consumption and production. It really is a private market solution to this public problem. And I have to tell you, I think we'll find there'll be more opposition to it than you think. We've already seen groups of 500 scientists who came out and said that carbon capture doesn't work. You've heard people coming out that carbon tech is fake. You have us being expropriated in Quebec, even though we were proposing to the government of Quebec a solution that was lower emissions energy than, in fact, that we have the CREG report, materially lower environmental impacts on all 16 of those factors except emissions, which we were about 10% higher. But on every other factor, we were well below hydro from an environmental impact point of view, well below hydro, if you can imagine, and still rejected. So imagine that we did this and Canadian oil and gas became synonymous with sustainable oil and gas and leading carbon tech solutions for the planet. That we have a government that was promoting, not apologizing for Canada, and that we were seen as an equal with Europe, America, and Asia because we'd stepped up that weight class and become the reliable supplier of low emissions energy of last resort. I think our biggest risk is this transnational movement that Tammy's going to talk about tomorrow of wanting managed markets and managed democracy. They're not going to like private market solutions to these problems. And I think if we don't find private market solutions, the WEFers will win on their big government solutions. And I think we have, and I think we can, and I think it's happening. I think this idea of energy transformation is happening right now in Alberta, right in front of our eyes without us necessarily knowing it. So I think the recent call by Liberals in their last climate, that was interesting. They said we're going to reduce emissions by 42%, and the Alberta oil and gas industry has to do most of it. But at the very same time, in the very same document, they said we need to increase production by 5% because we've got to help Europe and so on and so forth. So at Modern Miracle Network, right here on Earth Day, we're saying that's too little, but it's not too late. So we're calling for Canada to double its oil and gas production and all strategic resources by 2050 is our answer for Earth Day. I think it's a really exciting time. And I think Ukraine has revealed for many Canadians what our role in the world should be. I think it's a technological paradigm shift for us to think about sustainable hydrocarbons. I think the oil and gas industry is going to win the race to sustainability. and that Canada can stand up as senior partners, double our production by 2050, and have the 21st century belong to Canada. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll be right again. So do we have any questions? We might be wearing people out of questions, but thank you for a very inspiring. I guess the oil industry's done it before; they can do it again. So, just while you were talking about when you're dealing with the Americans, you have to have your wits about you. I always tell the story about the guy. He was a rancher, and he had an American up. He had 100 bred heifers for sale, and the American was up looking at him. And he said, "Well, what do you want for him?" And the rancher said, "Well, $2,000 if I pick him, and 4,000 if you pick him." Because of course, he was thinking to himself, he had somebody really would really like to have in his herd. And so anyway, the American rancher said, "Well," he said, "you pick him." He said, "I'll take them all." So you have to be a little careful when we're dealing with the Americans. But anyway, is everybody just David? Yes. Oh, yeah, the other two in. Yes, if we have any questions for anybody, maybe everybody's tired of asking questions and they're thinking it's happy hour time. But Catherine and Francis, would you like to come over for a glass of wine? If you were here, we'd give you a glass of wine sometime soon. But anyway, I think yes, yeah. Well, we do have a question. Oh, Michelle, and a good old Norm. Well, that's all right. You're allowed to have questions as long as they're 30 seconds. That's right. You can have 40 seconds because you're like a favorite of ours. Not to pick on Norm, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay, my 30-second question is, don't you think by solving these problems, you will get the same blowback from the environmental groups because they're actually being, in my view, pushed by the Climate Works philanthropists who want to establish global cap and trade markets. So they don't really want a solution to the carbon issue because that will destroy their market.
Go ahead. Right? Well,
yeah. So I felt that I talked about that directly. They expropriated me. I mean, the zero emissions is a absolutely world-leading project just that we would have been able to create in Quebec and that people are trying to create here in Alberta, and they expropriated me. That was the answer. Up until then, Quebec kept saying, well, if you can just get social license. But I realized upon re-engineering the whole project, coming up with something that was going to be zero, and I focus on the emissions because that's what we all talk about. When they talk about the ESG, most people just mean emissions, but there's 16 environmental factors. It was major advance on all 16 of them. And I realize now what they were really saying was, no, we don't want your capitalist ideas from Alberta. We don't want your private market solutions. Yeah. We don't want your disruption to our markets, but we don't want to tell you no either. So we'll just tell you to get social license because we know you can't get it. But we did get it. We did get the First Nations. We did get the local towns. We did get the farmers, and we did get the average Quebecer. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that coalition against us of the true believers, I think we've got support from true believers. But what we don't have support for are the big government solutions people, and we don't have support from the opportunists, the entrenched interests who have got a lot invested in it. So I think we have to realize that even if we come up with something, let's call it perfect, and I don't want to imply that these solutions are perfect. When I talk about zero, these are near zero, practical zero, not, practical zero. Just like wind, solar, and hydro aren't zero either. But it would be competitive with those projects. I think we will still have opponents. I think I'll shout out Tammy Nemeth again. I hope you'll see her tomorrow. These opponents are against us as much because they're against capitalism as they're against emissions. So I guess I agree. I don't think it's going to be, well, look, we solved this. It's going to be easy. And that's why I said at the end, that call to action and the discussions that we had this morning about we need to stand up to governments with John Carpe. That's what this whole conference is about, is standing up for freedom, standing up for free markets, not managed markets, for liberal democracy, not managed democracy. So Michelle, I think you're 100% right. Even if we're perfect, it's not going to be easy.
Let's not forget, too, how many people are making out like bandits by riding this bandwagon. And should we actually reach solutions, they'll be looking for their next paycheck. So, there's so much self-interest wound up in this. And I agree, Michael, this is in part a political agenda, not a climate agenda at all. In fact, it's in large part a political agenda to achieve big government, big taxes, and keep the gravy train rolling for all these NGOs and everything else that are sucking up public money to give themselves a very comfortable life.
You sound like Malcolm Roberts' sister, like you're certainly calling it as it is. Yes, thank you very much. And anybody else want to comment on that question? I asked Bob, do you want to comment? No, he said he's just, Norm, you got 30 seconds.
I don't get it. I want to see this chart. I'll look at that while you're asking the question.
He's probably going to show it.
I just want to stick it up very quickly.
Go.
Okay. This is carbon pollution. This is carbon pollution. Canada does not have any. China does. If you read all of the legislation, there is nothing in the legislation that regulates against carbon dioxide emissions anywhere. They regulate against greenhouse gases emissions, and there's no such thing as a greenhouse gas. And they regulate against carbon emissions, and Alberta has the most stringent carbon emissions regulations in the world. And carbon emissions are fine carbon particulate matter, so they're not a gas, and they form the major component of PM 2.5 pollution, which is the index for air quality. So I guess I have to ask a question. Why are we concerned? Why are we concerned about CO2 emissions when they're not legislated against and they're of great benefit to the environment? We're much better off if we get up to 400, 500, 600 parts per million. It's greening the earth.
Thank you, Norm. Okay, you want to comment that, or will?
I got my answer to that. So I've made the point. It's not just one environmental factor. It's 16, and I think that we need to be looking at a world with 10 billion people in it, all wanting a higher standard of living, and all using more energy per person. And what impact is that going to have? And I think we have to realize that there are environmental issues coming. And if it's not CO2, then it's going to be some of the other associated emissions that come with the burning of fossil fuels. If it's not that, it's going to be biodiversity. It's going to be a lot of different things. And I think we need to say, well, let's stop arguing about this CO2, right? Because Joe Oliver makes a point. If there's not a single difference to the climate by 2050, we have the exact same climate with the exact amount of extreme weather events as we do today. Extreme weather is still going to be a much bigger problem, simply because there's more people living in areas that experience extreme weather. So this idea that we want to have a debate about the CO2, it misses the point. It misses the point that there's an environmental problem that we have to deal with. And we should all realize that we know it's true, just looking backwards. We had smog problems. We had to solve them. We had management of forestry problems, management of fishery problems. All of these pressures came up because of increasing population, and there's more pressures coming. So I think that's the number one thing. The second thing that I think is important for us to realize is that people are worried. I mean, people have existential angst about how will the world work with 10 billion people in it. And a lot of times as climate people, it's a metaphor for that worry. People just are saying, look, I don't know what the problems will be, but I know there's going to be problems, and those people seem to have solutions. And those people over there say, I shouldn't care. You're not going to convince people not to care about that growing population. We have to come up with private market solutions that will address all 16 of those environmental factors. Otherwise, we are going to lose, and we will get the welfare solution.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I beg to differ here a little bit. I mean, the world has been dealing with a wide variety of environmental problems for a long time, whether they're energy related or not. Most of those environmental problems related to the local effects of economic activity. You know, it could be sulfur dioxide or particulates or some other, and some of those have been dealt with through international agreements to deal with them. Carbon dioxide is a whole other category. Carbon dioxide, or greenhouse gas emissions, if you will, concerns fundamentally the use and provision of energy services upon which our standard of living depends. And the agreements that have been reached at the international level have to do with targets for emissions reduction of greenhouse gases, to try to attain these targets that have been now, as I've said, the targets are political targets. They're not legal targets. That doesn't mean that they're any less important in terms of what Canadians and industry have to respond to. But I think there's an order of difference about the carbon dioxide challenge.
Can I just say that?
Sure, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so I just say, first of all, I agree with that. But being right's highly overrated, right? We're living in a world where people are concerned, and it's not just the one thing, CO2, that's the one factor out of 16 environmental factors. And I think if we want to get stuck in that we think we're right, and I think there's lots of good arguments to believe that we're right about the CO2 not being much of a concern, I think it doesn't matter that we're right on that issue. I think it's overrated. I think we have to address that there is worldwide societal concerns around what a growing population is going to mean to the environment, and we have to propose private market solutions for that and not stand on that we think we're right about one of those issues.
Catherine or Francis, any comment, or are we good? No, we're good. Let's take another question. Paul Mitchell.
Paul Mitchell. I don't think being right is ever overrated. I do agree that there are pressures, and of course, increasing population does cause that. But conflating CO2 with pollution is a very big mistake that we should avoid. I'd just like to ask a question to the first two speakers from this. Well, I'd like to ask for a comment from the first two speakers. And I'm going to give you a quote from, his name's RJ Scaringe, and he's the CEO of Rivian. They make electric vehicles. And he said, quote, "Put very simply, all the world's cell production," he's talking about EV cells, "combined represents well under 10% of what we will need in 10 years, meaning 90 to 95% of the supply chain does not exist." So given that they can't even make the batteries, what's with pursuing policies that go down a dead end? So I'd like a comment on that. Thanks.
You want to comment on that, Robert? You're the policy expert, I guess. Well, I guess.
Well, as I said in my remarks, I think that there are serious materials limitations that will prohibit the world from being able to attain the magnitude of emissions reduction that are being talked about, for implementing the types of emission reduction measures that are currently being considered. I don't disagree, incidentally, about the importance of adopting a private sector solutions to the extent that they're feasible. There are some things that are just not technically feasible, and that's where you really run into the barriers. There's another kind of dimension here which has to do with the freedom of choice. I mean, of governments at this point in time are severely limiting the choices that producers and consumers have. That's even if things are technically feasible or economically feasible but not attractive, they won't happen. But if governments impose the requirement to use them, then we're all going to be faced with having to make some sort of an adaptation to that.
Thank you.
I would
go ahead, Francis. You're our battery expert.
Yeah, I think that the lack of supply chain for electric car batteries is a very small part of but I'm not saying a meaningless part, but only a small part of the lack of supply chain for batteries overall to theoretically back up the entire world economy, now powered only by wind and solar. And how about the supply chain of building all those solar panels and wind turbines, which so far as of now, I think they're up to supplying about 2 or 3% of primary energy in the world. So if they're going to supply all of it, that all has to be multiplied by something like 30. That's 30 would get us to where we are now, but then we have to electrify the entire third world, and China and India and Africa and Indonesia and so forth. So there are many limits that will be hit before this ever happens. The only thing that can accomplish a modern economy that we have now is fossil fuels.
Andy, did Steve push you to the back of the line, or are you, no, okay, go ahead, Steve, and then Andy, and then maybe we'll call that good.
Hi, Steve Portlands. Just about recombining CO2 and water. One's an oxidation reaction, the other one's a reduction reaction. Anyway, to put those two back together, it takes incredible amounts of energy, I think more so than when it's created. Anyway, but I wanted to just my opinion about the CO2 factor and what it means to the world. I guess fossil fuels is a limited source. It's not infinite, it's finite. What do we got? 200 to 300 years left in total gas, oil, whatever. The question is that when we get to that point, or as we get to that point, we definitely have to have an alternative fuel. I'm a believer in tidal power. I think there's huge benefits from tidal power. You could go off the coast of British Columbia and every fjord could produce enough power to fire fuel or energy to all of Western Canada. That's my opinion on that. But I think that have you even explored tidal power as being one of the major options for providing electrical energy to Western Canada?
If you don't, I was going to say, if you don't ask a question, we're going to start calling you Norm's other brother, Daryl. Okay, you got something.
I won't answer a question, but I'll just answer the point. So first of all, the point that this idea of wind and solar and it not being possible, I think that's just self-evident almost at this point, right? That's why I'm saying, and that we absolutely need our world energy systems to use fossil fuels. It's the only way they're going to work. And that's what I'm saying, well, let's not make that a 20th century choice between the environment and the economy. Let's transform oil and gas so that we can have both. We can keep the E in that ESG, and we can also continue to have energy systems. So I'm agreeing with that point. I'm just saying let's have a transformation over the next 30 years of oil and gas into a lower emissions energy product. The other quick 2 points is I've now spent time looking at least 30 companies, and there are dozens and dozens of these technologies to convert CO2 into products. And I'll make the point that we already have made 2 agreements that I'm absolutely confident are economic at under $100 a ton. And what they do is they rely on not just heat back in, there's also catalysts. But they're reactor-based technologies. So I'm happy to explain that to anybody who wants the time, but that's not really a question. It's an actual fact. You can recombine CO2 into other products, and there's many, many different technologies. That's just a fact, and it can be done with catalysts for lower energy than what you were thinking.
Good, thank you. Andy, go ahead.
Permitted some license.
Yeah, you're a little bit, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name's Andy Crooks. Amongst other things, I'm responsible for bringing Michael Binnion into the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He and I were both chairmen of the board. And the CTF changed the language around finance in Canada, government finance. We changed the culture of Canada. We had a lot of other players, but we learned that lesson can be done. What Mike and Catherine in particular have really highlighted, I think, is the key issue, which is the change of culture. We're talking about culture of freedom, and Mike's talking about a freedom solution, which I second. And I'm currently chairman of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. And our mandate, it's a bit like John Carpe's. John used to work for us at the JCCF. Our mandate also touches on something else that's come up, which came up earlier today, but it's being talked about here. It's the problem of agency for the administrative state, the administrative bodies that govern and rule us. There are a lot of rice bowls that are being built and that are hardening by the day. There's various industries, in particular around climate change, now around this flu that's spread around the world, around many, many issues in the day. And Mike has run into those in Quebec, and we're seeing those all the time. But Mike is on the way to changing the culture and changing the culture and debate around the language. I guess I'm supposed to ask a question somewhere around here.
Carry on. If you have one, we'll take it.
Is there any finer Canadian than Danny Hozak in the world? I don't know. There's a question. I guess I really have a question for the audience. Do we really believe, if we're grandparents for freedom? I like that. Is that yours or Mike's?
Well, it was actually, I think it was when we first started, Alan Balsam was at the back of the room, and I said, well, we're going to try and get the governments to live within their means. And he said, well, you might as well just pray for the second coming. I said, well, I do, but it gives us something to do while we wait. So we're just sort of waiting. But yeah, there's been a whole group of us working at it. Yes.
Grandparents for change.
Yeah.
Do we in this room believe that we can change? That we can change Canada? That we can change the language, the culture, and the way Canada works? Do we believe that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep.
Are we going to try?
I tell you, there's a few of us here in this room who believe it because we've actually done it. We've seen it happen. And in fact, we can be the winners. Yes, I believe that we can change Canada. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I assume you fellows will give you each both, I assume you agree with that, but we'll give you each a couple of, go ahead. No, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I'm just going to tell a story, especially since we're on this theme of grandparents. So 1970s, I was in Calgary, and there was 400,000 people in the city then. So today we're 1.2 million people. So the population has tripled in the intervening 50-ish years. And everybody lives in bigger houses on average. People drive more cars on average. And somehow the air and water got cleaner in that time. Right?
Yeah, absolutely did, yeah.
So I just want to tell you, but just to think back, and so I can go back and say, if anybody had said in the 1970s to me or to anyone that we're going to triple the population, people are going to live in bigger houses and drive more cars, and the air and water will be cleaner, they would have thought you were crazy. So I just want to put that thought in your mind about what could happen with oil and gas between now and 2050.
Go ahead, Bob.
No.
You're absolutely right again, Michael. Like in the early 70s when I was going to university, as you know, acid rain was a huge thing, and they thought that was going to be the end of everything. It was going to hurt the crops. It was just, there was no way we were going to survive it. Well, obviously that was another challenge we met, but we'll take one last question and we'll go from there. So come on up. That'll be all right. This is not public speaking. You're talking to friends.
So I'm not an academic, but I listened to everybody today. And one of the common themes that I've struggled kind of to understand is why the science is so pliable and debatable. Like I was just looking at the 500 scientists that were kind of against this, and I'm just trying to grasp why so many scientists can disagree with each other. It's hard for me because I kind of look at science as something that has evidence and is clear to equal people to understand as a whole. So
That's a good question. Bob, you want to tackle that?
Follow the money. Follow the money.
Well, okay, here. Who wants to answer that? Do you want to answer that, Catherine? No.
No, I just said follow the money.
Follow the money.
There's
Oh, yes.
massive amounts of money being paid to people. And if you look at the academic scientists, how many of them have been fired for being heretics? You know, for questioning this climate conventional wisdom. You know, they get punished. So it's a political agenda that is caught on to the climate cause. and it's been allowed to be pervasive because I think it's such a compelling issue. Everyone cares about the environment. Of course we do. And so everyone can relate to it. So it's been politicized very successfully, and there's a huge amounts of money behind it. And you know, scientists are like everybody else. They like to have a job and feed their family.
And I'd like to toss in a small thought. I fault the high school education in Canada, although I'm sure the U.S. has fallen apart equally as well, and I'm in the U.S. But when I was in high school, they taught me the scientific method, and they taught me that science is a method which consists of falsifiable hypotheses, always subject to challenge, and the scientific method consists of trying to disprove a falsifiable hypothesis. Now, there's a different concept of science, which is science is what all the scientists believe. It's a body of accepted knowledge. As far as I know, that's the opposite of science. There is no body of accepted knowledge. If it's science, it is a falsifiable hypothesis subject to challenge and falsification. If it's not that, it's not science. So to the young lady, I would highly recommend that you try to find something that teaches what actual science is. And I agree with Ms. Swift. The people who wear white coats and look like scientists and tell you that science is an accepted body of knowledge and they're the priests who know it, those are anti-scientists on the government payroll, and they have nothing to do with science.
Yeah, that's exactly my answer. I mean, when I went to school, science was a verb, not a noun, right? And I just think there's been this cultural shift from the scientific method or scientific process is a way for us to explore and understand the world, to that there's now become this need to have a noun called science, which is as an authority. But the problem with that is it just leads to whose science is more sciencey, right? Like, oh, I think your science is more sciencey than my science, or the way. And so I think we've sort of lost our way in this idea that there is this external, there's this thing called science that tell us what to do. It's a process by which we discover the world, and by the way, it's the scientists disagreeing is how we best discover the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just have one rather snide comment. I'm not a scientist. I'm an economist. I'm glad the scientists don't always agree. It's sure a good thing that economists always agree.
Yeah. What a mess we'd be in if they didn't. Exactly. Well, I was actually on a Modern Miracle call. You know, I think it was a year ago, Michael, and someone said, well, like the left are years ahead of us in their messaging and false information, quite frankly. And I said, well, actually, they're not years ahead of us. If you'll Google Regina Manifesto, like it was I think in the 1920s, where some people in Regina, of course, got together and they were trying to figure out how to create a socialist utopia on the prairies, and they listed off all the things they were going to do, and they were going to get control of the schools, the governments, and the municipal governments. They were going to get control of the universities. I mean, they've been at it for 100 and some years, and we've got quite a battle. But as to quote the Frodo from the Lord of the Rings, like, I guess there's something worth fighting for, and I guess we're the ones who are going to do it. So let's stop and have supper and get our strength back, and then we'll get back together. So let's have a warm round of applause for all our speakers. So thank you.
Thank you.